Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still think about that day, even though it's been over 20 years. Every time I close my eyes and let my thoughts drift, I'm back there, on that damn trail. I guess I should tell you about it. It was September 24th, 2002, a day I had marked in my calendar for a long-awaited solo hike on the Ruckle Creek Trail in Oregon. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the silence, the smell of the pine needles, the feeling of being miles away from the stress of everyday life. I wasn't expecting to find anything more than some peace and quiet. I was very wrong. I started my hike early in the morning, and everything was pretty uneventful at first. The sun was filtering through the trees, and the air was crisp. A perfect day, really. I remember stopping around noon, right by a bend in the trail, to take a sip of water. That's when I heard it. A loud, deep noise, almost like a growl but not quite, coming from the direction of the underbrush to my left. It wasn't a typical animal sound, not something I'd heard before in the woods. It made my chest tighten. My first thought was that I must have surprised a bear, and I froze, trying to remember all those bear safety things I'd read. But it didn't feel right. There was something about the sound that was different, more deliberate. Suddenly, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head slowly and saw something that still haunts me. It was a creature, and it was moving away from me, going up the steep hill ahead. At first I thought it might be a gorilla. Yeah, I know, it sounds crazy. But the way it moved, the sheer size of it, and the distinct shape of its head, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I knew. Its back was massive, covered in dark fur, and its shoulders were ridiculously broad. It looked like it could plow through the trees without even noticing. I could only see it for a few seconds, but those were the longest seconds of my life. My hands shook as I reached for my camera. I had one of those cheap point-and-shoot film cameras back then. I managed to snap a photo, but by the time I did, the creature had already disappeared into the trees. I felt like I had just imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I saw. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I stood there, trying to convince myself to keep moving and not just turn around and run back the way I came. Then, as I tried to calm down, I noticed something else. From the corner of my vision, further down the hill where the creature had disappeared, I saw a face, a smaller one. It was just peeking out from behind a tree, almost like it was watching me. I couldn't make out much detail. It was far away and the trees cast long shadows. But there was something distinctly unsettling about it. It wasn't a human face, at least not any human I'd ever seen. The eyes were dark, deep set, and it was just staring at me. I blinked, and it was gone. My stomach sank, and I could feel the fear crawling up my spine. It was like they knew I was there, and they were curious, or maybe even annoyed. I decided to keep moving, walking faster now, trying to get as much distance between me and whatever the hell I had just seen. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. It had to be some kind of animal, right? Something explainable, but the sheer size of it and that face... No, nothing added up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me just out of sight. I didn't hear anything more, but every now and then I'd catch what looked like a shadow moving in my peripheral vision. Eventually, I got to a more open part of the trail, and I started to feel a bit safer. The sun was still out, but it was starting to dip lower, and I knew I had to make it back before dark. I couldn't get my mind off what I'd seen. I kept replaying it over and over, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe I was just tired, but no matter how I spun it, it didn't feel like my imagination. That thing was real, and it was huge. When I finally got back to my car, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief, like I just barely escaped something I couldn't understand. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to process everything. I almost didn't want to look at the photo I'd taken, half afraid that there'd be nothing there, half afraid of what I might actually see. But curiosity got the best of me, and I developed the film later that week. The photo didn't show much at first glance, just a blur of trees, some branches, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the background, almost hidden among the shadows, there it was. A shape, tall and dark, just like what I'd seen that day. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, but it was there. My stomach did a flip when I saw it. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't crazy. I've shown the photo to a few friends over the years, and most of them just shrug it off. They say it's probably a trick of the light, or that I'm seeing what I want to see. But I know what I saw that day, and it wasn't just some play of light and shadow. Something was out there, something big, and it was watching me. I still go hiking, but never alone anymore. And I've never gone back to Ruckle Creek. There's this primal fear inside me now, a fear that maybe those woods are home to something we aren't meant to see, something that wants to stay hidden. I can't shake the feeling that, if I go back, I might not be as lucky the next time. I guess I'll never know what it was that I saw that day, and maybe it's better that way. But every once in a while, when I'm out in the woods and the wind rustles through the trees, I get that same feeling again, like I'm being watched, and I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching, and remembering me just like I remember it. My wife and I were on vacation, and since we love exploring nature, we decided to visit the south of Mount Hood. It was a trip we'd been wanting to make for a while. Something about the mountains appealed to us, perhaps because of the tranquility or the promise of wild landscapes. On this particular day, we decided to take a dirt road that went off the main route. There was no sign or indication that it was a tourist route, but that's what seemed interesting to me, exploring the unknown and getting away from the hustle and bustle of tourists. We followed the dirt road for about 20 minutes, surrounded by dense trees on both sides, and began to notice that the place was becoming more and more isolated. Everything seemed quieter than usual, but I didn't really care. I thought maybe it was just the isolation. There came a point when we decided to stop the car and take a walk. The idea was to walk around a bit, breathe in the fresh air, and maybe find somewhere to take some photos. My wife was excited, but as we got out of the car, something in the air seemed different. That kind of silence that stuns the ears, you know? As if the place itself was holding its breath. After walking through the forest for about 5 minutes, we found something strange on the ground. They were large droppings and definitely didn't look like those of any ordinary animal. The thing that made me most uncomfortable was the fact that they looked human, but huge, as if they belonged to a much, much bigger person. My wife looked at them and gave a nervous smile, as if to say that this was just part of the experience. I tried to relax, but there was something inside me telling me that it wasn't right. Even the smell seemed too harsh, almost like a natural warning that we should leave. We continued walking, but the feeling of discomfort grew. My wife was the first to say out loud, "Don't you feel like you're being watched?" I tried to ignore the question because, to be honest, I was already feeling something like that, but I didn't want to admit it. You know when you feel vulnerable and instinct tells you to get out of there, but you try to be rational and stay. Well, I was at that point. That uncomfortable silence with no sound of birds or insects was too strange to ignore. It was then that my wife suddenly stopped, wide-eyed, staring at something in the trees. She didn't shout. She didn't say anything. She just pulled me by the arm and pointed with her head as if the movement was enough. When I looked in the direction she was pointing, I saw something that made my heart race. It was a figure, tall and covered in reddish-brown fur, moving quickly between the trees. It looked humanoid, but much bigger and wider than anyone I had ever seen, and it was walking on 2 legs. I only had time to see the creature for a moment, but it was enough to freeze my blood. It didn't run or make a sound. It just walked away and disappeared into the trees, almost as if it had never been there. My whole body went on alert, and I felt a chill run down my spine that wasn't just fear, it was a primal sense of danger. Without saying a word, my wife and I looked at each other and knew we couldn't stay there. Without arguing, we started walking back towards the car. Every snap of a twig I heard seemed to be a sign that it was following us. I tried not to look back, for fear of actually seeing something watching us again. My wife squeezed my hand so tightly that I could feel her fingers trembling. The way back seemed much longer, and the silence became more and more suffocating, as if any sound could trigger an unexpected reaction from what we had seen. I felt that if we ran or showed fear, it could provoke it, as if the creature could sense the panic. Finally, we spotted the car, and I felt such a wave of relief that my legs almost failed me. My wife practically threw herself into the car, and I followed, locking the doors as soon as I slammed mine. Not a word was exchanged between us as I started the car and turned around with my heart still pounding in my chest. We crossed the dirt road back, and I was only able to relax a little when I was back on a busier road. Even after we had left the forest behind, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It felt like something had stuck to us, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. My wife was also strangely quiet, looking out of the window as if she expected to see something coming up behind her. When we finally stopped at a small restaurant to get something to eat, she turned to me and just said, "Don't tell anyone about this, okay?" And I agreed, because part of me didn't even want to think about what we'd seen. Even now, after a few months, I can't forget that figure moving between the trees. I've heard of Bigfoot before, of course, but I always thought they were just legends or exaggerated stories. Now, I don't know anymore. What we saw was real, that's for sure. And it wasn't just any animal. It seemed intelligent, as if it knew we were there and was watching us as much as we were watching it. It's hard to explain the kind of fear I felt at that moment, as if something much bigger was beyond our control. The scariest part is thinking that it's probably still out there, hiding somewhere in the depths of the forest, perhaps watching others who venture too far, as we did. I'm not the type to easily believe in supernatural things, but after that day, I came to respect the unknown more. Some things just can't be explained, and maybe that's for the best. We got out of there unhurt, and I'm grateful for that. But to this day, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we'd stayed a little longer? I never thought I'd be one of those people who have one of those stories that you see on the internet and think, that sounds too good to be true. But it happened to me, and it still gives me goosebumps to this day. It all started during a camping trip we took to Sherwood on the east side of Mount Hood. It wasn't a very popular place, which seemed perfect to us. Just me and my friends, no one around, and the kind of peace that only a place like this can provide. That morning I woke up early, well before the others. Waking up before the sun rises has always held a special charm for me, and that day was no different. The air was fresh, the mist covered the ground like a wet carpet, and everything was so still that you could almost hear the silence. I decided to take a short walk around the camp, more to ward off the cold than anything else. I walked towards the bushes, taking care not to make any noise, because some of my friends were still snoring in the back. That's when I saw it. At first I couldn't believe it. I swear my mind tried to come up with a common explanation, like a bear or some other animal, but it wasn't that. It was two creatures covered in fur, about 20 meters away from me, half hidden among the bushes. One of them, huge, must have been at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The other was much smaller, maybe 3 feet. I stood there, frozen, trying to process it. The smaller one seemed to be playing. It had a branch in its hand and was spinning and swinging like a curious child. She wasn't aggressive or anything, she seemed genuinely amused by it. The bigger one, however, was on the alert. It moved slowly, always keeping one eye on the smaller one and the other on the surrounding area. She seemed careful, as if she was there to protect. At that moment, what crossed my mind was that this larger creature was the mother of the smaller one. I tried to lean forward a little more. I wanted to get a better look, and that's when I made the mistake. I blinked and accidentally stepped on a dry branch that snapped too loudly. The sound echoed through the forest, and for a second, everything seemed to get even quieter. That's when the largest of the creatures turned its head and looked straight at me. I'll never forget those eyes. It wasn't an expression of anger, but there was an intense look, as if it was assessing me, like deciding if I was a threat. For a few seconds that seemed like minutes, we just stared at each other. I felt a fear I can't describe. It wasn't just the fear of seeing something I couldn't understand, but also a deep feeling that I shouldn't be there, that I was invading something that didn't belong to me. I could hardly breathe. The creature then reached out and took the smaller one by the arm in a delicate, almost maternal way, and suddenly they started to walk away. The two of them simply turned and walked off into the woods. The smaller creature looked back once, as if curious about me, but the larger one gently pulled it along, keeping pace. There was no rush, no desperate escape, just a calm retreat. And then they were gone, disappearing into the trees, as if they had never been there. I stood there for a few more minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. My mind was in a whirl. I knew that if I told my friends, no one would believe me. I mean, who would? It was something I myself had always been skeptical about, until I saw it with my own eyes. After a few minutes, I finally managed to move and headed back to camp. When my friends started to wake up, I even thought about talking about it, but gave up. It didn't seem like the kind of thing you share without being made fun of or called crazy. So I just pretended that nothing had happened, even though my heart was still racing and there was a tingling sensation on the back of my neck. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with everyone making jokes and cooking marshmallows, while I tried to understand what I had just witnessed. The strangest thing is that, when I finally talked about it with one of my friends a few weeks later, he mentioned that that morning he woke up feeling that there was something strange in the air, but he didn't know what. I don't know if that was just a coincidence or if he really felt something, but it made me even more convinced that it wasn't a dream or a hallucination of mine. It was real, and I saw it. To this day, I can't get that image out of my head, that look, that connection between the two creatures and the way they left without making a sound, as if they were part of the forest. I don't know what they were, but I know they were no ordinary animals. I got this strange feeling, a mixture of fear and awe, as if I'd witnessed something that wasn't meant to be seen. I haven't been back to Mount Hood since. Whenever my friends suggest it, I come up with some excuse. I think part of me is afraid that I might see those creatures again, but at the same time, another part keeps telling me that I'll never get that chance again. I just know that, after that day, my view of what is and isn't out there changed completely. It's hard to explain to people. Most people think it's funny, or think I'm making it up, so I don't usually talk about it. But if there's anyone here who's been through something similar, they know what I'm talking about. That feeling that something else is out there, something we don't understand, but which exists. And I saw it. I didn't want to, but I saw it. And that changed everything for me. I never thought I'd be one of those people who sees something inexplicable in the woods and comes online to share the experience. But after what happened to Ryan and me on Mount Hood, I feel I need to tell you about it to try and take my mind off it. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still get goosebumps every time I think about the details of that day. It was a sunny Saturday, and we decided to explore a remote area at the foot of Mount Hood. Nothing much, just a new trail that an acquaintance had recommended. Something about unspoiled landscapes and the chance to see some wildlife. I thought it would be fun, and frankly, I needed a break. We walked for about an hour until we found a clearing. That's when we saw it for the first time. There was a figure sitting on a log straight ahead, right in the middle of the clearing. At first glance, it looked like a robust man, perhaps a backpacker who had stopped to rest. He had his back to us, and you could see his broad shoulders and dark hair. Ryan even made a joke about the guy probably enjoying the best place for a snack. But as we got closer, something didn't seem right. His hair, or rather his fur, was long and covered his entire head and shoulders. There was no backpack and no visible clothes. We stopped at every step, exchanging nervous glances. Ryan whispered something like, "That's not a bear, is it?" But it didn't look like a bear. Its body had a strangely human posture. The fur was a dark, dirty brown, as if it had been there for a long time. What made me freeze, however, was the moment when the creature turned its head slightly and looked straight at us. Those eyes. They were deep and dark, but not like those of an animal. There was something there, something I can't describe. A curiosity? A warning? All I know is that it made me shiver. Ryan and I stopped. For a second I thought I should turn around and run, but it was as if my feet were stuck to the ground. The creature didn't make any aggressive moves. It just kept watching us. We decided, somewhat silently, not to go any closer. That's when I noticed something strange on the log where it was sitting. There were deep marks, as if the creature's claws or fingers had dug in, tearing the wood. Around the trunk, the ground was crumpled, as if something very heavy had spent time there. Ryan tried to grab his cell phone to take a picture, but the moment he did, the creature stood up. We didn't run, but we didn't stay to see any more either. We started taking slow steps backwards without turning our backs on it. My heart was racing, and I felt that chill down my spine that doesn't let you think straight. When we finally reached a reasonable distance, we turned around and went back the way we came. We didn't say anything for a long time. The silence of the forest seemed even more oppressive after that. As we walked back, we came across something else. A bed had been made in the middle of the forest. It was like a nest, but bigger than anything I've ever seen. Twigs, leaves, and what looked like moss were woven together, forming a kind of padded area. The smell was strong, something between damp earth and sweat. Ryan and I looked at each other, and that was enough to understand that we needed to get out of there. We didn't want to stay and find out who or what was sleeping there. We reached the car in a silence that was only broken when I finally started the engine. Ryan looked at me and just said, "What was that?" I didn't have an answer, and frankly, I still don't. I've tried looking for reports from other people who may have seen something similar, but all I can find are theories. Bigfoot, a forest dweller, an unknown species. None of it seems real to me, but I can't deny what I saw. Ever since that day, I've had nightmares. I always see myself back in that clearing, with those eyes watching me. But the worst thing is the sound. I swear I hear a crack, like wood being broken every time I close my eyes. I haven't told many people about it. Who would believe me? Even Ryan avoids talking about it. When we meet, we pretend that nothing happened, but I know that he also feels the weight of this experience. I know it may sound absurd, but if any of you go to Mount Hood, be careful. I'm not saying don't explore the region, but pay attention. There's something out there that we can't explain. Maybe it's for the best. Maybe some things should be left unanswered. All I know is that day, something watched us, something that wasn't just an ordinary animal, and I'll never forget those eyes. I never thought I'd have to tell anyone this, but it seems that a story like this only gets heavier with time if you keep it to yourself. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened that morning. I went deer hunting with my father and our neighbor. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, but it turned into one of the scariest moments of my life. We left before dawn. My father always said that the best time to hunt is when the forest hasn't even woken up yet. The neighbor, Jerry, was the kind of guy who always had an exaggerated story to tell, and I was half prepared for another day full of funny lies about what he'd seen in the woods. We had a simple plan, split up far enough to cover more ground, but not so far that we couldn't communicate if we needed to. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath mixing with the mist coming off the trees. After walking for quite a while, I found a good place to hide and wait for some movement. It was very quiet. Around 7 in the morning, I saw something moving in my peripheral vision. It was a tall figure. He looked like my father, running through the forest, but something was strange. He was running almost perfectly, as if he were floating between the trees. He didn't make a sound, not even a stick broke under his feet. I remember that the first thing I thought was that my father was hurrying to tell me something, but he didn't run like that, not like that. The thing moved fast, but it didn't seem to be in a hurry. It was athletic, with long, firm strides, and I could clearly see the steam from its breath coming out at regular intervals, a bit like a horse. I watched it for a good 15 seconds, mesmerized by the way it moved. My instinct told me it was my father, but something was screaming in my head that didn't make any sense. My father was never that big. That thing had a build that looked more like a linebacker than an ordinary hunter. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and when I turned my head, there was my father, calmly walking towards me. He gestured silently for me not to move and pointed to some spot in the woods where he thought there might be something. I felt my stomach sink and my heart start to pound. If my father was there, who the hell was he that I had seen moving like a ghost among the trees? I took a deep breath and looked back in the direction the figure had disappeared. There was nothing there. No sound, no movement. The neighbor, Jerry, appeared soon after, and the three of us stood there for a while. I tried to cover it up, but something was very wrong. I told my father about what I had seen. He looked at me a little seriously, a little suspiciously, and just shook his head. "Probably a moose," he said, but I knew he wasn't convinced. We continued hunting, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It felt like there was something there watching us, hidden among the trees. The kind of feeling that makes the back of your neck shiver. Every time I looked out of the corner of my eye, it seemed that a shadow was moving, always out of my direct reach. Jerry, the neighbor, was laughing and telling one of his exaggerated stories, but I could hardly pay attention. My mind was stuck on the image of my father, running in silence, in that impossible way. After a few hours, we gave up and went back to the car. I couldn't get it out of my head, that insistent image of the figure. What disturbed me most was the athletic, almost majestic way in which the thing moved. Back at home, I tried to forget about it, but in the evening, after dinner, I took out my cell phone and started searching the internet. I didn't know exactly what to look for, so I started with things like tall creature in forest and figure running silently. That's how, for the first time, I came across the reports about Bigfoot. I read everything I could find that night, accounts of people who had seen something similar. A large, athletic, silent figure, something that couldn't possibly be human, but which had an almost familiar presence. Every detail seemed to fit. The accounts described a creature that was not only large, but also incredibly agile, and that gave off a feeling of indescribable discomfort to anyone unlucky enough to cross its path. The more I read, the more my stomach clenched. It was as if I was reliving that moment in the forest, seeing it all over again. Ever since that day, I can't go back to that area without feeling a heaviness in my chest. I'm not sure if what I saw was really a Bigfoot. I've never been the type to believe in such things, and maybe that's exactly what makes me so uncomfortable. Because I saw it. I know I saw it. That thing was so much bigger than any human I've ever seen in my life. It moved in a way that simply isn't possible for us. My father never mentioned that day again, and I didn't insist either. Maybe he saw something too and preferred to ignore it, or maybe he just thought I was impressed by some shadow or something. But somehow he stopped suggesting that area for hunting. Now we always choose another route, a little further away, and every time I ask why we don't go back there, he just says that the place hasn't been lucky lately. I don't know if I want to go back there. Part of me feels an absurd curiosity, almost a need to understand what it was like. But another part, a deeper, more instinctive part, knows that maybe it's better to let it go. Some things don't need to be unraveled. They simply are what they are, and we just have to move on. The strangest thing of all, and what really makes me shiver to this day, is remembering the way that thing seemed to imitate me, the posture, the way it ran, the steam of its breath. It was as if it was trying to be human somehow, as if it knew I was there, watching, and wanted to trick me. And that, more than anything else, convinces me that what I saw wasn't just any wild animal. To this day, when I'm alone in the forest, I keep expecting to see that movement again, that shadow in my peripheral vision, and every time my heart squeezes, hoping I won't have to relive that feeling. Maybe it's just my imagination, but once you see something like that, you never look at the forest the same way again. And frankly, I don't think I'll ever hunt with the same peace of mind as before. All right, I've been sitting on this for a while, but I think it's time I share what happened. This isn't the kind of thing you just forget, and honestly, I've been a little nervous even typing it out, but I figured if anyone would get it, it's you guys here. It all started when my buddy Mike and I decided to check out this water tank area near his family's cabin. It wasn't anything official or touristy, just this remote patch of land surrounded by dense woods, pretty out of the way. We were just messing around, exploring like we did a lot when we had nothing else going on. It had rained the night before, and the ground was all slushy, covered in that thick kind of mud that grabs onto your shoes and doesn't want to let go. We weren't expecting anything unusual, just a bit of fun trudging around. We were making our way along the edge of the tank, just talking, when I noticed these impressions in the mud. At first, I thought it might have been a bear, but as we got closer, it was clear these weren't bear tracks. They were massive. I mean, like, if I put my boot inside one of these prints, there was still a good inch or two all around my foot. And the depth, They were deep, like whatever made them was way heavier than anything that should be out there. You could see the toes clearly, all 5 of them, which just made my stomach drop. I don't know how to explain it. There's something about seeing toes that just made it feel human, but off. Mike and I looked at each other, kind of half smiling at first, like it was a joke we didn't get yet. But as we followed the prints, that smile just started fading. The tracks led away from the clearing into this dense patch of trees and brush where it got darker. I remember feeling this cold dread settle in my chest as we kept going. It wasn't just the cold, the air got still, like even the birds decided it wasn't worth it to stick around. That's when Mike stopped and said, "Man, I don't think we should keep going." And honestly, I was already thinking the same thing. We both just stood there, staring into the brush where the tracks disappeared, listening. I've never been one to get freaked out easily, but something about it felt wrong, like we were pushing into something we weren't supposed to see. We turned around and made our way back, trying to act casual, but I could tell Mike was spooked. I felt like we were being watched, that prickling feeling on the back of your neck when you know there's eyes on you. Days later, Mike convinced me to go back. He'd been thinking about it non-stop, said maybe we could get a closer look, maybe even cast the prints. I wasn't exactly eager, but curiosity got the better of me. When we got back to the clearing, the mud had dried up a bit, and you could still see those tracks. Mike had brought plaster, and we got to work making a mold. The whole time, I couldn't shake this feeling, like something was about to happen. Mike wandered off a bit, checking out the tree line while the plaster was setting. That's when he froze. I'll never forget his face, eyes wide, pale, like he'd just seen a ghost. He pointed, and I turned just in time to catch it. Just a flash, but enough to be burned into my mind forever. A pair of legs, covered in this dark, matted fur, disappearing into the brush. They were long, and they moved fast. Faster than any person could run through that thick undergrowth. It was gone in an instant, but the movement was so smooth, almost like it was used to navigating that kind of terrain. Mike just said, "We're leaving, now." No arguments. We grabbed the mold, still a bit soft, and we hightailed it out of there. I'm not ashamed to say I was scared, like heart-pounding, get the hell out of here kind of scared. As we walked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those legs again, or worse, whatever they were attached to, following us. When we got back to Mike's cabin, we looked at the mold we'd made. The details were insane. You could see the lines in the skin, like the way your palm looks if you press it into clay. Whatever made that print was real, and it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't human. We didn't talk much after that, just kind of sat there trying to process it. Mike eventually said, "We're not going back there," and I didn't argue. It's been a while now, and neither of us has gone back to that spot. I've thought about it more times than I can count, but every time I do, I get that same feeling in my gut, like a warning. I don't know what we saw that day, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Maybe it was just some animal, something explainable that our minds twisted into something else. But then I think about those legs, the way they moved, and I know deep down that there's no easy explanation. People talk about Bigfoot, about sightings and prints and weird noises in the woods, and I always thought it was just stories. Fun to tell around a campfire, but not real. But now I'm not so sure. Whatever we saw, it's out there, and it's big, and it's fast, and it's smart enough to stay hidden. I'm just glad it decided to keep its distance that day. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't. So yeah, that's my story. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot, but I'm not saying it wasn't either. All I know is there are things out there that we don't understand, and sometimes it's better to just leave them alone. I don't know how to start this without sounding like I'm exaggerating, but I'll try to be as direct as possible. It all happened a few months ago, during a trip I took with my wife and our 2 children. It was late at night, around 11 p.m., and we were driving along Interstate 84. It was raining, that insistent rain that doesn't get heavy but never stops, the kind of rain that only makes the road more dangerous and darker. Visibility was poor, so I drove very slowly, concentrating on each curve and keeping control of the steering wheel. My wife was almost dozing off, and the children were already passed out in the back seat. That's when it happened. I was trying to overtake a truck when I saw something moving alongside the road, right there in the right-hand lane, where the headlights could barely reach. I had to blink a few times, thinking I was seeing things, but the figure became clearer as I got closer. It looked like a person, but at the same time, it wasn't one. It was running, with strange, clumsy movements. I remember thinking that maybe it was someone wearing an oversized fur coat, which seemed completely out of place in all the rain. I slowed down even more because, honestly, it didn't make sense to have someone running around like that. My wife woke up with the bump of the car, and she also saw the figure. As we approached, the thing, whatever it was, leapt across in front of us. I braked so hard that the tires squealed, and everything inside the car shook. I'm sure I hit it, at least in the leg. I felt the impact, something cushioned, as if I had hit a large bag of sand, only alive. At that instant, my headlights illuminated the thing's face, and I swear we made eye contact. What I saw was fear, deep fear. It didn't just look like an animal trying to escape, it looked like a creature that knew it was in danger. Its eyes were big and round, reflecting the light, and for a split second it looked so human that I was paralyzed. My wife let out a scream, more out of surprise than fear, and I could only stare ahead, trying to understand what was happening. The thing kept running, and I saw it hit the bumper of another car coming in the opposite direction. It was a dry, horrible noise that I'll never forget. I thought that was the end of it. But to my utter amazement, the creature got up from the asphalt, staggering as if it were injured, and then ran into the forest beside the road. It was so fast that it looked like it was fighting for its life. The rain, the car headlights, all mixed together, it seemed like a bad dream. But I was there, and I saw it. I know I saw it. When it disappeared between the trees, the car that had crashed stopped further on, and I thought about getting off, but my hands were shaking so much that I couldn't let go of the steering wheel. After a few seconds that seemed like minutes, my wife asked, almost in a whisper, if I was all right. I didn't know what to say. She had seen it too, hadn't she? I wasn't going mad. I looked through the rearview mirror and saw my children still asleep with no idea what had just happened. I turned on the warning light and pulled the car over. I couldn't go on driving after that. The driver of the other car also pulled over and got out, and I could see that he was as lost as I was. He looked in the direction of the forest and then at me, as if looking for some confirmation that what he had seen was real. I had nothing to say to him. We stood there in the rain, staring into the darkness of the forest. Suddenly, it seemed that any movement among the trees could be that thing coming back. Someone called the police. I don't know if it was my wife or the other driver. They arrived quickly, which surprised me, and said that they had already received other calls about the animal on the road. But you know, the way they spoke, it was as if they didn't believe it was just an animal either. One of the policemen even commented, a little sideways, that earlier he had received a similar call from another point on the road. When the police finally arrived on the scene and started searching, it seemed like a formality. They lit up the forest, walked a few meters into it, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The thing must have been long gone. Meanwhile, another policeman asked us a few questions. He wanted to know if we were okay, if we'd hit our heads, and made a point of making it clear that a lot of people see strange things at night on these roads. He tried to reassure me, but that only made the feeling of unreality grow. I didn't need reassurance. I needed an explanation. When we had finished with the police, we went back to the car. My wife was still in shock, and so was I. We continued the journey, but the rest of the way was silent. I tried to concentrate on the road, but every time I looked out of the corner of my eye, I expected to see that thing running again. The rain was still falling, and the sound of it on the roof of the car seemed amplified, as if it were mocking what we had just experienced. I remember thinking how it sounded like one of those stories you see on internet forums, but there I was, being the person telling it. I can't tell you what it was. Bigfoot? Maybe. I'm not the kind of person who believes in these things, but after that night I just can't rule out any possibility. The way that thing looked at me, the fear in its eyes, it seemed as real as anything I've ever seen. And that's what keeps going through my head. It was a creature trying to survive, running away from us, from our cars, from the lights. It wasn't just a lost animal. It was something that understood danger and was desperate to escape. To this day, my wife and I hardly talk about what happened. She says it was just a big scare, that it was probably a bear or some other animal, but I know she saw it too. Her silence on the subject says more than any words. I've also tried to rationalize, to think that it could just be a bear, but nothing fits. And well, the fact that more people that night called the police, that gives me a little comfort. At least I know we weren't the only ones. The truth is that after that night, I've never been able to drive down Interstate 84 without feeling a tightness in my chest. Whenever it gets past 10 at night, I take another route, even if it takes longer. And when it rains, I don't even think about taking the road. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget the look in that creature's eyes. I know it sounds like something out of a movie, and I'd feel skeptical myself if I read this account, but all I can say is that I was there, and I saw it with my own eyes, and to this day, every time I hear the sound of rain hitting the roof, I remember that night, and honestly, I hope I never experience anything like that again. My girlfriend and I had planned this trip to relax. Just the two of us, nature, and a bit of peace. We had managed to borrow a friend's mother's cabin, a remote place in the middle of nowhere, perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. We arrived in the late afternoon, just before the sun went down. The plan was simple: light a fire, drink a few beers, and enjoy the sound of the lake. Everything was going well, and around 10 p.m., my girlfriend and I decided to take a walk around the area, kind of exploring the surroundings a bit before heading back to the cabin. That's when we saw it for the first time. A tall, extremely hairy figure moving between the trees on the opposite shore of the lake. I remember thinking it was some kind of large animal, maybe a bear, but there was something about the way it moved that made me freeze for a second. It wasn't just the size, it was the posture. It was erect, but at the same time it leaned in, as if trying to be stealthy. I signaled to my girlfriend, and we both stared in absolute silence. The thing simply moved behind the trees and disappeared from our sight, as if it had never been there. I thought my eye was playing tricks on me. At this point, my girlfriend was clearly uncomfortable, so I suggested we go back to the cabin. I didn't want to show that I was scared, but something in the air, a strangeness, a feeling of being watched, wouldn't let me relax. As soon as we got close to my friend's mother's Suburban, I realized that it wasn't just one. In the middle of the darkness, there were two other smaller creatures crouching there near the car. They didn't move, as if they were watching us or, worse, waiting for something. My heart raced, and I had to blink a few times to be sure of what I was seeing. They weren't bears, or anything I'd ever seen before. They were smaller than the first creature, but no less frightening. I ran into the cabin trying to wake my friend up. It took him a while to understand what I was saying, probably thinking I was playing a trick. When we finally managed to convince him to come out and see, he opened his eyes wide and muttered something like, "Is this really real?" It was surreal. I didn't know if I was relieved that someone else was seeing it, or if I'd rather it had all been a delusion. We decided to use the Suburban to try and illuminate the creatures. I got into the car, my hand shaking so badly that it took me a few seconds longer to turn the key in the ignition. As soon as the headlights came on and I started maneuvering, the creatures simply got up and ran into the forest. And when I say ran, I don't mean they moved like normal animals. It was an almost unnatural speed, as if each of their steps took them out of reach of our comprehension. We went back inside the hut, locking up everything we could. Nobody said much after that. We were all trying to understand what we had just seen. My girlfriend was pale, and my friend kept looking out of the window, as if waiting for something to come back. It was hard to explain, but even after the creatures disappeared, the feeling of danger didn't go away. Every noise in the forest seemed amplified. Every snap of a twig, every leaf moving, was like a warning that we were not alone. Around midnight, we heard a noise outside. Something was moving near the car. For a moment I thought the creatures had returned, and the panic was instantaneous. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window slowly, trying not to make any noise. My hand was still shaking when I managed to point the light outwards. It was just a raccoon rummaging through some bags we'd left by the door. But at that moment, anything that moved seemed like a threat. My heart was racing. That night no one could sleep. We stayed in the living room all together in silence. The tiredness was immense, but the fear was even greater. We were each dealing with it in our own way. But the look on my girlfriend's face said it all. She wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. My friend was sitting by the window, as if he were our lookout, even though he knew there was nothing we could do if the creatures decided to come back. When the sun finally began to rise, the tension eased a little. Daylight brought a false sense of security, but no one was willing to stay there to find out if it was really safe. We packed our things as quickly as we could and left. On the way back, we hardly talked about what had happened. It was as if, speaking aloud, we had to accept that it was real. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, and that's what scares me the most. They weren't just shadows or figures that I could have mistaken for something else. They were creatures, real ones, moving around, watching us. Maybe it was a warning never to go back there again. And honestly, I don't intend to test my luck. Every time I see pictures or hear reports about Bigfoot, I remember that night, and the chill immediately runs down my spine. Something tells me that the forest has secrets that aren't meant to be discovered, and I'm fine with leaving them hidden. I never thought I'd be one of those people writing about a Bigfoot sighting on the internet, but I can't keep this to myself anymore. I feel like I have to share it with people who might actually believe me. This happened just a few weeks ago, and every time I close my eyes, I can still see it clear as day. I was on a morning hike, just after sunrise. I love getting out there early, especially when the world still feels asleep. It's calming, you know? There was a chill in the air, and a bit of mist hanging low over the ground, which just made everything feel even quieter. I had my binoculars with me, like always. I like watching birds, and there are some really cool ones in the area that time of year. I was following the path when I noticed something strange. 2 dark shapes, standing upright in the distance, right near the edge of a clearing. At first I thought they were bears, standing on their hind legs. I've seen bears do that before, trying to get a good look around, but there was something off about the way they moved, like they were too smooth, almost human-like. Curiosity got the best of me, and I raised my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. These weren't bears. They were something else. 2 figures, covered in dark, shaggy hair, probably around 5'3" or so, not fully grown, but definitely not cubs. They were standing there, facing each other, kind of bouncing on their feet. They looked like kids playing, almost like they were having some sort of game. One would slap the other lightly on the arm, and then they'd both jump back and sway, like they were trying to fake each other out. I was frozen in place, just staring. I know it sounds ridiculous, but for that minute, I forgot to even breathe. I was too scared to move, but at the same time I couldn't look away. The way they moved, it was so carefree, like they didn't have a worry in the world. They didn't know I was there, or if they did, they just didn't care. I felt like I was intruding on some secret moment, something I was never supposed to see. They were sort of lanky, with long arms that hung almost down to their knees. Their hair wasn't thick like a bear's. It was more like a shaggy, unkempt coat. I couldn't make out their faces in detail, but I could see enough to know they weren't animals I'd ever seen before. The way they interacted, it was almost like siblings fooling around, testing each other, like they were sharing some private joke. I've never seen anything like it. They seemed happy, if that makes sense. Then, just like that, everything changed. They both suddenly stopped, like they heard something I couldn't. Their heads snapped around in unison towards the tree line. It was like some invisible switch had been flipped. One moment they were carefree, the next they were dead still, alert. That's when I felt this chill, like the air had shifted. I couldn't hear anything, but it was obvious they did. Their body language went from playful to tense in a heartbeat. Without another sound, they turned and walked, not ran but walked, straight into the trees. Their movement was so fluid, and they vanished into the forest like they'd done it 1,000,000 times before. It was eerie how quickly they disappeared, like they were just a part of the forest itself. One second they were there, the next they were gone, swallowed up by the shadows. I kept my binoculars up, trying to follow them, but they blended in so well that I lost sight of them almost instantly. I stood there for a while, just staring at where they'd been, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why, but I didn't feel like I should follow them. It was like some instinct told me to stay put, to not even try. I've heard people say they feel fear during these kinds of experiences, but that's not what I felt. It was more like awe, mixed with a kind of unease, like I'd witnessed something pure, something wild that I shouldn't have been allowed to see. The strangest part is, after they left, the forest went silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive quiet. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I've never heard it go that quiet before. It's hard to explain, but it felt like the whole world had just paused, holding its breath. I've never felt so alone, even though I knew I was surrounded by life. Eventually, I turned and started back down the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not in a threatening way, but like I wasn't alone anymore. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those two figures standing there, watching me from the trees. Of course, there was nothing, just the mist and the trees and the path ahead of me. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe they were just bears with some weird fur pattern, or maybe I was seeing things because I was tired, but none of that really makes sense. I know what I saw. They moved too smoothly, too deliberately. They had this intelligence in the way they looked at each other. I've never seen an animal do that. It's hard to explain, but it's like they had a purpose, a reason for everything they did. Ever since that morning, I've been on edge. Not scared exactly, but changed. I don't go out that early anymore. I tell myself it's because I don't want to risk running into a bear, but deep down I know it's because of what I saw. Part of me wants to see them again, to prove to myself that it really happened, but another part of me, maybe the smarter part, isn't sure I'd want to. There's something about seeing something you can't explain that sticks with you, like an itch you can't scratch. I know some people won't believe me, and that's fine. Honestly, I'm not even sure I believe it myself half the time. But I keep coming back to that moment when they looked at each other, the way they seemed to share something between them. It was real. I know it was real. And even if I never see them again, I'll always remember those two figures playing in the clearing, just for a moment, like the world was theirs and theirs alone. So this happened to me a few years ago, and I still don't know how to digest it. I'm not the type to believe in strange things, but after what I've experienced, there's no way I can just ignore it. I was working on a farm near Forest Grove here in Oregon. It was a day like any other, and I was driving one of the tractors, preparing the soil for the new harvest. So far, so normal. The sun was just starting to descend over the horizon, so that orange light was dominating the field. I loved this time of day. I was focused on my work, but my gaze wandered to something I caught a glimpse of on the other side of the field. I thought it was a man crossing that way. You know when you see someone and your mind automatically starts trying to identify who it is? Well, that's what I did, but I soon realized there was something wrong. The figure was tall, but not tall in a normal way. It was like a human stretched out, you know. There was something about that height that didn't make sense. I slowed down the tractor and tried to focus my eyes better. The creature had a rounded head, kind of flattened, and you couldn't see a neck. It was as if its head was directly on its shoulders and its posture was stooped, almost as if it were crawling, but with a firm step. The first thing that came to mind was that it was definitely too big to be a person. It must have been at least 2.10 or 2.60 meters tall. Easy. My first instinct was to think that I was seeing things. Maybe I was tired from work, the late afternoon light, anything that could account for it. But as the figure moved, I knew it was real. The creature walked across the field towards the walnut grove on the farm's border. Those woods always gave me a strange feeling, as if they were hiding something. And this time, it seemed that it really was. It moved in a very fluid way, almost without making a sound, which was strange for something that size. It didn't seem to be in a hurry, but it didn't hesitate either. When it got close to the trees, it simply disappeared. It wasn't as if it had vanished into thin air, but it entered the middle of those walnut trees, and that was it. I stood still for a moment, still on top of the tractor, trying to process what had just happened. The most bizarre thing was that Even though it was something totally out of the ordinary, I didn't feel afraid. It was more a feeling of curiosity, as if I was seeing something I shouldn't be seeing, but which didn't cause me any immediate danger. The image of that figure stuck in my mind, the head without a neck, the huge body, the half-curved posture. I couldn't forget it, no matter how hard I tried. Over the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to return to the same field several times, and every time I passed by my eyes went straight to the woods. You know when something pulls at you, and you need to confirm that everything is still the way it should be. That was it. Until one day I decided to get off the tractor and measure the height of those trees near where the creature had entered. I needed to get a clearer idea of the size of that thing. I walked into the woods, looking around to see if I could find any signs, footprints, broken branches, anything. But the ground was too hard, too dry for any footprints to be marked. Even so, when I got close to the walnut trees, I was able to get a sense of the size of the figure. It must have been at least 2.5 meters, maybe even more. It just made everything more real, more difficult to explain. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't a play of light. I saw it. To this day, I think a lot about what it could be. I've read stories about this Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or whatever it's called, but I always thought it was a legend, something made up to scare people. Now, after seeing something like this with my own eyes, I'm not so sure. I didn't see the creature's face. I didn't get any fine details, but there was something about it that seemed aware, as if it knew I was there and simply didn't care. I've never talked about it with anyone, really. Who'd believe it, right? A farmer saying he saw a Bigfoot while working in the field? But here, on this forum, it seems to make more sense to share. Maybe someone has experienced something similar. Maybe there's someone out there who understands what I saw, or at least doesn't think I'm going crazy. After that day, I never saw anything strange on the farm again, but the feeling stayed with me. Every time I pass near those woods, I feel a chill run down my spine, as if something is still watching me from there. It's not a constant sensation, but it happens from time to time. I know it sounds like something in my head, but it's hard to ignore. It feels like something there has never really gone away. I don't know if what I saw was really this Sasquatch, but I do know that it wasn't an ordinary man, nor was it an animal I'd seen before. It was something different, something I can't explain. And sometimes I think that maybe it's for the best. There are things that perhaps we shouldn't fully understand. In the end, I just wanted to put this on record. I saw it, I know what I saw, and that's what matters. If anyone else has had a similar experience, please share. I'd love to hear about it and try to understand a bit more about what's going on out there. We may never know the truth, but at least we're not alone. I'm not sure how to start this here, but I'm still trying to understand what happened that night. I was driving along Highway 219. It was about 11 o'clock at night. It wasn't the first time I'd taken that road late at night. It's a route I usually take a lot, but that night, there was something different. The road was especially quiet, and I hardly saw any other cars. Do you know when the air feels strange, as if it's heavy? Well, that's exactly how it was. I was driving alone, the radio playing softly, trying to keep awake. That kind of night where everything seems frozen, as if the whole world was asleep, and only you were awake. That's when I saw him. The figure suddenly appeared around the bend, standing there on the shoulder. I almost went straight over, but something in my head made me slam on the brakes, and the headlights illuminated the creature. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was something different. Very tall, covered in golden and brown fur that seemed to glow a little in the light. For a second, I thought it might be a log, you know, something lying by the side of the road. But it wasn't. It had shape. It had a body. The hairs were long, wavy, as if they were being sculpted by the wind, but the creature didn't move. I stood there for a good 3 or 4 seconds, trying to process what my eyes were seeing. There was something familiar about the figure, like Chewbacca from Star Wars. Only it wasn't a movie. It was real, and it was right in front of me. The creature was standing with an almost solemn posture, its very long arms falling at its sides. And the eyes. I think I saw the eyes for a moment. It was a strange glow, a reflection of the light from my headlights perhaps. But it was as if it was looking at me, staring back at me. An empty look, but at the same time, as if it knew I was there. My heart was racing. I didn't know whether to speed up and get out of there, or keep staring, trying to understand what it was. Suddenly, something in my gut told me to keep driving, so that's what I did. I pressed the accelerator and passed it. As my car pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, standing there like a statue, not moving a centimeter. I kept waiting for it to make a move, anything, but nothing. It was as if she had frozen there, as part of the landscape. My whole body was tense. I could feel the cold sweat on my hands as I gripped the steering wheel. After a few minutes, I tried to convince myself that it must have been my imagination. Maybe it was just a log, a shadow cast by the headlights, but something didn't fit. I know what I saw. That wasn't a moose, it wasn't a deer, and it certainly wasn't a person. It was too big, too tall. Its posture was different, as if it were on the alert, but at the same time it was so calm, so still, that it didn't look like a living being. It wasn't natural. I think what disturbed me most was the fact that at no time did it seem afraid of me. Any animal that had been there would have run away at the sound of the engine, at the headlights in its face. But not this thing. It just stood there, watching, as if I were the intruder. I felt small, insignificant, as if I was invading the space of something that belonged to that road more than I did. After I passed, I kept driving for a long time, but I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, hoping to see that figure again. Part of me wished it had disappeared, that it was just a figment of my tired mind. But the other part was terrified of the idea that maybe she was following, walking silently along the roadside, stalking me from afar. When I finally reached my destination, I was exhausted. But it wasn't the normal tiredness of a long journey. It was mental fatigue, as if my head had run a marathon trying to make sense of what I had seen. I could barely sleep that night. I lay in bed, reliving those few seconds when my headlights shone on that thing, thinking about how close I got and how it just didn't move. The next day, I told a few people about it, but you know how it is. Everyone thinks it's just a story, an invention. Some people suggested it could be a bear, but I swear it wasn't. I saw the arms, I saw the posture, I saw the arms, I saw the posture. It didn't look like anything I've ever seen before. Not even photos of standing bears looked like that. It was something different, and the worst thing is that I can't get it out of my head. The image of the figure standing by the side of the road still haunts me. I can't explain it, but there's something about the memory of that night that gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. Maybe it was the way the hair shone in the light, or maybe the way the thing just didn't react. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm convinced I saw a Sasquatch. I know a lot of people think it's bullshit, that it's just an urban legend, but after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. Since then, I can't drive along Highway 219 without getting a chill down my spine. I keep looking sideways, hoping to see something moving among the trees, something watching me from the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever have an explanation for what I saw, but one thing's for sure, that was no ordinary animal. And the scariest part is that, for some reason, I feel like it was there for a purpose, as if it had been waiting for me, and that's something I'll never forget. So I don't know how to start this. I've never really shared anything like this before, but after lurking around here for a while, I figured this might be the place. This happened a few months ago, and I still can't get it out of my head. I guess I just need to put it out there, see if anyone's experienced something similar. It was a weekend afternoon, nothing special. Just one of those days when I felt like getting some fresh air, so I went to this urban trail that's on the edge of the city. It's not really a popular spot. I mean, it's the kind of place where you'd maybe see a couple of dog walkers or an old guy jogging, but most of the time it's pretty empty. I liked it that way, honestly. I enjoy being alone out there, just walking, clearing my mind. The trail cuts through a sort of half-wild area, lots of overgrown bushes and trees that look like they've been there forever. It's a little rugged, but I've always found it kind of peaceful. That day, though, there was something different, something I didn't really notice at first. but it started creeping in on me. You know that feeling when things are just a bit off, but you can't put your finger on why? I was about halfway through my walk when I noticed this awful smell. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. It was strong, musky, like wet fur mixed with, I don't know, something rotting maybe. It made me stop in my tracks, and I actually looked around, thinking maybe a deer or some other animal had died nearby. I even covered my nose with my sleeve. It was that bad. As I'm standing there, trying to figure out what could be causing the smell, I hear this rustling in the bushes. Not like a squirrel or bird. This was heavy, like something big was moving. I turned my head just in time to catch a glimpse of something big, covered in dark brown fur, crossing the trail maybe 50 meters ahead of me. It moved so fast, I almost thought I'd imagined it. But I know I didn't imagine it. I know what I saw. It was upright like a person, but it wasn't a person. It was too tall, too bulky. The shape of it, I'm telling you, it wasn't human. My first thought was maybe some guy in a costume or something, but that made no sense. Who the hell would be out here in a costume, in the middle of the day, miles away from anything? And why would they be running like that? I grabbed my phone. Instinct, I guess. I wanted to record it. My hands were shaking, and I was fumbling with the stupid camera app. By the time I got it open and pointed in the direction it had gone, there was nothing there, just the trees swaying a bit like something had brushed past them. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could hear was my own breathing. Then that feeling hit me, like I was being watched. I can't explain it, but it was so strong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt like I had to leave. It wasn't a rational thought, more like pure instinct. I've never felt anything like it before. It was like I knew, deep down, that whatever I'd just seen was still out there, somewhere in the trees, watching me. I started walking back, trying not to look like I was panicking. But I was. I'll admit it. Every crunch of leaves behind me made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the empty trail, the trees, and that smell. It lingered, like whatever it was had marked the whole area. I've heard people talk about fear as this cold thing, but for me, it felt hot. My face was flushed, my hands were sweaty, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. The whole walk back felt like it took hours, even though it was probably only 20 minutes. I didn't see anyone else, not a single person, which only made it worse. Usually, I'd run into at least one or two other hikers, but that day, it was like the entire trail was abandoned. By the time I got back to my car, I felt like I'd run a marathon. I locked the doors the second I got inside and just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe I just imagined the whole thing, but it doesn't add up. Bears don't walk like that, and they definitely don't disappear into the trees like a ghost. And that feeling, that overwhelming sense of being watched, I've never felt anything like it before or since. I haven't gone back to that trail alone since then. Honestly, I'm not sure if I'll ever go back at all. I know it sounds crazy. I've told a couple of friends, and they just kind of laughed it off, said it was probably my imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. There's something out there, something that's not supposed to exist, and I'm not sure I want to know what it is. I still think about it sometimes, usually at night when I'm trying to fall asleep. I'll close my eyes, and for just a second, I'm back there on that trail, with that smell in my nose and that feeling of eyes on me. I don't know if I'll ever get answers, but I guess that's part of it, right? Sometimes things happen that we just can't explain, and we have to live with that. Anyway, that's my story. I'd love to know if anyone else has had an experience like this. Maybe it'll make me feel a little less crazy. Thanks for listening. I'm going to tell you everything, without beating about the bush, the way it happened, because I still can't understand what we saw that night. It was a Friday night, around 10:30. Marcos and I decided to go fishing in a lake a little way out of town. We always did this when we wanted to get away from the routine, you know? The lake was about 40 minutes away by car, and it was very isolated, surrounded by dense trees and no cell phone signal, just the way we liked it. The idea was to stay there for a couple of hours, chat and try to catch some big fish. Everything seemed normal that night until it wasn't. We'd been there for half an hour, and I remember that the sky was clear, full of stars. The only thing we could hear was the sound of cicadas and the occasional sound of water. Until then, everything was peaceful, and the atmosphere was kind of relaxing. We were sitting on the edge of the lake, with our flashlights switched off so as not to scare the fish, each with our own fishing rod, chatting about the week. That's when I heard something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was a loud crack coming from the tree line behind where we were sitting, like, you know, when a dry branch breaks under something heavy. That was it. And it wasn't just one crack, there were several, as if something was moving there. Marcos and I looked at each other at the time, not saying anything, half expecting the other to laugh and say it was just something in our heads. But the sound continued, getting closer and closer, and I could feel that it wasn't a small animal. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the noise. And man, I swear, what I saw chilled me to the bone. In the middle of the trees, right on the edge of our field of vision, there was a huge figure. Her eyes reflected the light of the flashlight, glowing a shade of yellow-green. It wasn't like the glow in the eyes of a deer or any of the other animals you're used to seeing out there. It was louder, more sinister. Marcos turned on his flashlight too, and for a second, the light from both of them hit the thing. I couldn't see all the details, but I could make out the outline. It was definitely bipedal, and much, much bigger than a normal man. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I could see that it was covered in something that looked like thick fur. It wasn't a bear. I've seen bears, I know their size and their manner. This was different. It had an upright posture, almost human, but in a completely wrong way. The sound of breaking branches stopped for a moment, and the thing just stood there, looking at us. I felt a chill run down my spine that I had never felt before, a feeling that it shouldn't be there, or perhaps that we shouldn't be there. It was at that moment that the adrenaline hit. I looked at Marcos, and without even needing to say anything, we decided on the spot. We'd better get out of there. Quickly. We started to gather things up a bit clumsily, but honestly, we didn't manage to get everything. A few rods were left there, as was the cooler. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of that place as quickly as possible. As we ran back to the car, I could still hear noises in the tree line, as if the thing had started moving again. I don't know if it was coming towards us or just moving away, but I didn't stay to find out. We got into the car, and my hands shaking, I managed to start it. Marcos was white, and I know I must not have looked much better either. I just remember accelerating as fast as I could down the dirt road, while trying not to look in the rearview mirror. I had the feeling that if I looked, I might see that thing running after us, and that was an image I just didn't want to carry around. When we finally arrived back in the city, we stopped at a gas station that was still open, and stayed there for a while, trying to calm down. Neither of us said anything. We just stared at each other, as if we wanted to confirm that it had really happened. Marcos lit a cigarette, and his hands were still shaking so much that he could barely hold the lighter. To this day, we don't talk much about that night. I know it sounds cliché, but it's true. Whenever anyone asks why we don't go fishing in that lake anymore, we just make up some excuse, like it's too far or we've lost interest. But the truth is that none of us has the courage to go back there, especially at night. Not after what we saw. I've tried to rationalize it in various ways. I thought maybe it was some animal I didn't know. Maybe it was someone playing a trick on us. But it just didn't make sense. The way that thing moved, its size, the sense of sheer menace emanating from it. I can't explain it. I know that many people will read this and think that we were just imagining things, that it was fear speaking louder. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. I don't want to make it sound like this is some elaborate horror story. I really wish it was, because if it was, I could just turn it off and forget about it. But that's not how it works when you actually experience something like this. To this day, when I remember those eyes shining in the darkness, it gives me a shiver that I can't control. And that's why I'll never set foot in that lake at night again, not for $1 million. I was driving alone on a back road a few months ago, headed to visit some family out in the countryside. It was one of those stretches of road that almost makes you forget where you are. Empty fields, patches of dense trees, and just an endless path of cracked asphalt stretching into nowhere. Honestly, it was peaceful at first. I had my favorite podcast on and was sort of lost in thought watching the landscape drift by. But then something really, really weird happened, and I still can't shake it. It was just after a bend in the road when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a tree or something, but then I realized it was moving. Something tall, like really tall, crossed the road up ahead. It was walking on two legs, kind of slowly, like it wasn't in a hurry. I slammed on the brakes because my brain couldn't make sense of it. It was covered in this grayish hair all over, and my first thought was that it was some guy in a costume, but something about it just didn't add up. It moved too smoothly. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like watching an animal, not a person. No jerky movements or anything like that. Its stride was almost elegant, but heavy at the same time, like each step had real weight to it. The way it crossed the road, it didn't even look over at me. It just disappeared into the trees on the other side, and for a moment I was frozen, just gripping the steering wheel, staring at where it had gone. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. Before, I'd heard birds and even the rustle of leaves as the wind blew through. But now, it was like someone hit a mute button. No birds, no insects, nothing. The silence was so thick that I could almost feel it pressing against my ears. My whole body felt tense, like I was waiting for something to happen, but I had no idea what. It was this kind of gut feeling, like when you know someone is watching you, but you can't see them. Then I heard it, a loud snap, like a branch breaking. It came from the woods where that thing had gone. It wasn't like a little twig. It sounded like something heavy had crushed a branch underfoot. I swear my stomach dropped right then. I couldn't see anything, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I didn't even think twice. I put my foot on the gas and took off. My heart was pounding the entire time I drove. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something running after me. The road felt endless, and the silence inside my car was almost suffocating. Even the podcast had stopped playing. I didn't remember pausing it, but I guess I must have done it without realizing when I first saw that thing. I was gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt, and I just kept whispering to myself, "What the hell was that?" When I finally made it to my aunt's house, I pulled into the driveway and just sat there for a second, trying to calm down. I could see my hands shaking. My aunt came out smiling and waved at me, and I tried to smile back, but I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. She asked me if everything was okay, and I just said I was tired from the drive. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic telling her I saw some giant hairy creature walking across the road. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to convince myself that it was just a guy messing around or maybe even some animal I didn't recognize. But the way it moved, that's what gets me. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going, like it belonged there. And that silence, it wasn't natural. I've driven those roads plenty of times, and there's always noise, crickets, birds, something. But this was different, like nature itself had stopped to watch. I've read about Bigfoot sightings before, and honestly, I always thought they were just stories, like urban legends or something. But now I don't know. I can't say for sure what I saw that day, but I know it wasn't normal. It wasn't just an animal, and it definitely wasn't a person. It was something else. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it knew I was there too. It just didn't care. Or maybe it did. And that's why everything went so quiet, like it was warning me. Since then, I haven't been able to take that road again. I go the long way around, even if it adds an extra hour to the trip. My family thinks I'm being ridiculous, but I can't help it. Every time I even think about that stretch of road, I get this chill, like a cold sweat. I don't want to see that thing again. I don't want to feel that silence or hear those branches breaking. It's almost like once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and it's always just there, somewhere in the back of your mind. I guess I'm sharing this because I need to know if anyone else has experienced something like this. I've tried looking it up, but most of what I find just seems like stories. Nothing that feels as real as what I went through. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or something else entirely, but whatever it was real, and it scared the hell out of me. I still think about that silence more than anything. The way it swallowed everything, like the whole world just stopped for a moment. I don't think I'll ever forget it. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to. It was supposed to be a normal weekend night, just a bunch of us teens bored in a small rural town. We'd heard about this old abandoned cornfield a few miles out, and someone thought it would be a good idea to check it out. I wish we hadn't. There were 4 of us, me, my buddy Eric, and 2 girls from school, Kayla and Jess. We got there around dusk, maybe a little later than planned. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, painting everything in this eerie twilight. The field was massive, rows upon rows of tall corn plants, mostly dry and yellowing since no one had tended to them in years. There was something unsettling about how quiet it was out there, not even the usual cricket sounds, but we brushed it off, laughing nervously, trying to act like we weren't scared. We started walking along the edge of the field, joking around, when Eric, always the daring one, dared us to go deeper into the corn. I swear, if it wasn't for him, none of us would have stepped into that mess. It was thick, and the stalks were taller than any of us, maybe 8 feet or more. As we made our way in, everything seemed to swallow us up. The only sounds were the crunch of our footsteps on the dry ground and the rustle of corn as we pushed through. I don't know when exactly I first felt it, but there was this growing feeling of being watched. It's hard to describe, like that tingle in your spine when you know something's not quite right. I looked at Kayla, and she seemed to feel it too. Her smile had faded, her eyes darting around like she was expecting something to jump out at us. Jess was a bit ahead, walking with Eric, when he suddenly stopped. He motioned for us to be quiet. That's when we saw it. It was just a shadow at first, moving between the rows. I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but it was too tall, way too tall. Eric whispered something like, "Is that a farmer?" But we all knew there was no way. This figure was massive. It moved so smoothly, almost gliding, and barely made any noise at all. We all stood there frozen, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The thing stepped into a bit of the fading light, and I swear I've never seen anything like it. It was covered in hair, long and dark, almost blending perfectly with the shadows around it. But it wasn't just the hair that freaked me out. It was the way it moved, like it knew exactly where we were, like it was playing with us. Jess let out this little gasp, and that's when the figure paused. It turned its head towards us, and I caught a glimpse of its eyes. They were deep, almost glowing, like they were reflecting some kind of light that wasn't even there. I think that's when panic truly set in. None of us said a word. We just turned and bolted. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. The corn was scratching at my arms and face, and I could hear Kayla right behind me, her breath coming out in terrified gasps. Eric was yelling something, but I couldn't make it out over the pounding of my heart. I just kept running, trying to find my way back to the road, feeling like that thing could be right behind us, ready to reach out and grab me. We burst out of the cornfield and onto the road, panting and shaken. No one spoke for a moment. We were too busy trying to catch our breath and make sense of what had just happened. I remember Jess was crying, her hands shaking as she kept looking back towards the field. Eric, usually the tough guy, just stood there, staring at the rows of corn like he expected that thing to come barreling out after us. We didn't stick around. We piled into Eric's old beat-up car, and he floored it out of there. The ride back was dead silent. Nobody wanted to admit just how scared we were, or even try to explain what we'd seen. I remember glancing back through the rear window, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the dark outline of the field fading into the night. It's weird because, after that night, none of us really talked about it. I mean, we mentioned it a few times, but always in this half-joking way, like we were trying to convince ourselves it wasn't real. But I know what I saw. We all do. There was something in that field, something that shouldn't have been there. I still think about those eyes sometimes, how they seemed to pierce right through me. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe some kind of animal I'd never seen before. But deep down, I know that's not true. None of us ever went back to that field. Eric moved away not long after graduation, and Jess and Kayla avoid the topic altogether. I've driven past the area a few times, and every time I get that same chill. The cornfield is still there, still abandoned, and I can't help but wonder if whatever we saw is still out there, wandering between the rows, waiting for someone else to come too close. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I can almost hear the rustle of the corn, that same eerie quiet that seemed to swallow up all the sound. And I wonder, did it see us as intruders, or was it expecting us? I don't think I'll ever know. All I know is that something was there that night, something that's better left alone, and I'm never going back to find out more. I was never the type to believe in things like Bigfoot. I always thought they were just stories to scare children or to make sensationalist documentaries. But what happened on that rainy day at my family's campsite still makes me think twice. I keep thinking back, trying to find an explanation that makes sense, but to this day, nothing seems to fit. I'm going to tell it the way it was, straight, because it was scary enough on its own. We were all gathered at the campsite. It was a weekend like that, full of noise from children running around, my wife trying to organize the mess, and me just enjoying time with my relatives. The forecast said it was going to rain, but we decided to risk it anyway. Around midday, the sky suddenly darkened and it started to rain, that thick rain that seems to swallow you up. We all stayed under the makeshift awning, trying to keep dry and eating some snacks. The atmosphere was calm until everything changed for me. It was half by accident that I noticed it. I was staring at the edge of the forest, a little distracted, while holding a cup of coffee. The rain was so heavy that it was making a mist in front of the trees, and that's when I noticed a shadow moving. It wasn't small. It was big, the kind that catches the eye. At first, I thought it was a moose or maybe a bear hiding from the rain, but as I focused more, my eyes began to understand better what I was seeing, and that's when the shiver went up my spine. It was a figure, tall, very tall, covered in dark fur, but it wasn't a bear. It was standing still, almost motionless, but with a posture that seemed curious. It was as if it was watching us, interested in what we were doing there, almost like a human being trying to understand. I remember standing completely still, trying to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me because of the rain and the mist. But no, it was there, and it was staring back at me. It took me a while to react. I think I was paralyzed for a few seconds, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Finally, I called out to my brother, who was standing nearby, and pointed in the direction of the thing. When he turned to look, the creature moved with a speed that made no sense for something that size. It was like a blur disappearing between the trees. And the silence that followed was strange. It seemed that even the rain had stopped for a moment, as if the forest had become expectant. My brother looked at me with an expression of total confusion, like, what did I miss? I tried to explain, but my words came out all slurred, and no one seemed to take it very seriously. People just thought I was joking or seeing things because of the rain, you know. But I knew I had seen something. I went over to where it was just to check, to see if I could find any marks or footprints. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing, apart from a horrible smell in the air, like a mixture of wet animal and something rotten. The smell was what made it all the more real for me. It wasn't something I was imagining. My wife came over and complained about the smell too, asking if any animals had died nearby. But there was no sign of anything. No footprints, no broken branches, just that stench that seemed to stick in the air. I remember looking at the forest, at the spot where the thing had disappeared, and feeling a sense of dread that I can't describe. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was a feeling that we shouldn't be there. I tried not to show how much it was bothering me, but it was difficult. My wife noticed how strange I was and asked if I wanted us to leave. I said I didn't need to, but deep down I knew I didn't want to stay there another minute. Everything inside me was screaming that this place wasn't safe, that something was wrong. The rest of the family was still laughing, drinking, and trying to enjoy the day, but I just couldn't relax. The rain continued, and I became increasingly restless. Every time I looked at the tree line, it seemed that something was moving there, just beyond my field of vision. I didn't see anything else directly, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if the place had changed completely from the moment I saw that thing. Every sound in the forest seemed louder, more threatening, and I couldn't stop imagining that figure standing there, watching us. In the end, my wife and I decided to cut our stay short. I made up some excuse about the weather, saying I didn't want the children to catch a cold. Everyone kind of complained, but in the end they agreed that the weather really was crap, and we started packing. While we were packing up, I couldn't stop staring at that edge of the forest, hoping to see that figure again, but it didn't appear. When we were almost ready to leave, one of the children mentioned that she smelled something strange, as if something was rotting. I tried to make a joke, saying that it was probably just some stray animal, but my stomach knotted up. That smell wasn't just a random detail, it was the only proof that something had really happened there, and I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. We drove home in silence, with the children dozing in the back seat, and I couldn't get that figure out of my head. It's been a while since that happened, and I still can't explain it. I've been back to that area once during the day with a clear sky, trying to find any sign, any mark that would prove I wasn't crazy that day, but I found nothing. It looked like a completely normal place, as if nothing had happened. To this day, I don't know what I saw. It could have been my imagination, some kind of shadow, but there's something inside me that knows it wasn't that. I saw something, and it saw me back. Since then, I can't camp the same way anymore. The idea of being exposed, vulnerable in the middle of the forest, makes me uncomfortable in a way I've never felt before. I know there are things out there that we don't understand, and that scares me. I don't want to sound like someone who believes every crazy story they hear, but after that day, I don't rule anything out anymore. There's something out there, something we can't see properly, that hides in the rain, in the shadows of the trees. And the worst thing of all is knowing that if it's there again, I wouldn't be able to prepare myself, because just as it started, it just ended. And I'm left with just the memories and the smell that never seems to leave my mind. It was one of those days when you just want to escape the routine, so I decided to take my bike and go for a ride on a trail I know well. I'd been there hundreds of times, and it had always been peaceful and relaxing. But that afternoon, something was different. It was almost evening. The sunlight was beginning to fade, and the air was getting colder. The silence was heavier than usual, just the sound of my bike and tires crushing the dry leaves on the ground. Around then, when I entered a section of the trail that has always been a bit isolated, I saw something strange. It was a figure crouching in front of a tree. It was far away, but I could tell it wasn't just anyone. There was something wrong about it. I stared as I got closer, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure was covered in dark hair and seemed to be concentrating, as if it was watching something on the ground. For a second I thought it might be an animal, perhaps a bear, although I'd never heard of bears in the area. But then, almost as if it had sensed my presence, the thing stood up. And man, that's when the dread hit. When the creature stood up, I realized that it was much, much bigger than I had expected. It was surreal in height, much bigger than any human being. Its legs and arms were huge and muscular, and I swear I felt my blood run cold. I was paralyzed for a second, just staring at it, trying to understand what my eyes were seeing. All I remember was the clear thought, this can't be real. Before I could react, the thing turned towards the forest and moved in a way that didn't seem natural. It was fast, so fast that it almost disappeared in front of me. The way it moved, effortlessly, cutting through the dense vegetation, made me feel as small and vulnerable as I've ever felt before. It wasn't a desperate run like a human would, it was something more fluid, as if that forest was the thing's natural habitat. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and get out of there as quickly as possible. Without a second thought, I turned the bike around and started pedaling back along the trail. My heart was racing, and all I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible. I didn't look back once. I just couldn't. The fear that it might be following me was paralyzing, and what was worse was the feeling that, if I looked, I could actually see it there, among the trees. I pedaled as if my life depended on it, sweat pouring down my face, my hands trembling on the handlebars. Every snap of a branch, every noise around me seemed to be that thing getting closer. My breathing was heavy, and the chill down my spine wouldn't go away. I don't know how long it took me to get off that trail, but when I finally reached the most open part, where I could see the lights of the city in the distance, I felt a relief that I didn't even know was possible. When I finally stopped, still shivering, I looked around, trying to convince myself that I was safe. I knew that no one would believe me if I told them what I had seen. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't been there. Even now, I'm trying to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was tired and seeing things. But deep down, I know it wasn't that. That thing was real, and I'll never forget what I saw. After that day, I promised myself that I would never go on that trail again, at least not alone. And so far, I've kept that promise. When someone mentions the idea of exploring that path at dusk, I make excuses. I change the subject. The thought of going back there makes my stomach churn. That figure, the way it simply disappeared into the woods, is still etched in my mind. I've always been skeptical of these Bigfoot stories, or whatever people claim to see out there. But now, after having lived through it, I understand why some people just keep quiet and prefer not to say anything. Who would believe them? It sounds like something out of a movie, I know. But it wasn't. It happened, and I saw it with my own eyes. The scariest thing is knowing that, even after all this time, I don't have an answer. All I have is fear and the certainty that it's there, somewhere. I know that I may never understand exactly what happened, and perhaps that's what scares me the most. Not knowing, not being able to give it a name, an explanation that will make the fear go away. Because deep down, what remains is this feeling, as if somewhere in that forest, that thing is still there, watching, waiting, and just thinking about it gives me a shiver that I can't control. I haven't cycled at dusk since that day. It may sound like an exaggeration, but the truth is that I can no longer look at sunsets in the same way. It's as if the light that goes away takes the security with it, and all that's left is that darkness full of shadows, where things we can't explain hide. In the end, I think that's what scares me, knowing that there are things out there that we simply can't understand. I don't really know why I'm writing this now. Maybe it's because I've been replaying that day in my head for too long, and I just need to let it out. Maybe someone here has had something similar happen. Whatever it is, I feel like I'll go crazy if I don't share. This happened about 2 years ago, right at the break of dawn, on one of those mornings that you almost feel lucky just to be out there, watching nature come alive. At least, that's how it started. I was perched up in my usual spot, a makeshift stand I had set up a few seasons back, overlooking a small valley surrounded by thick trees. The air was cold enough that my breath hung in the air, and everything was damp with that early morning dew. I was out there to watch for deer, like I had done dozens of times before, but the woods felt different that day. It's hard to explain, just this odd quiet, like the kind of stillness that's too heavy, like something was holding its breath. I remember seeing some movement out of the corner of my eye and turning my head slowly. At first I thought it was just a buck moving through the shadows, the way it kind of slinked between the trees. But when I focused, I could see it wasn't a deer. It was standing upright, walking on 2 legs. I squinted, trying to make it out, figuring it had to be another hunter, maybe someone who had gotten lost or wasn't familiar with the area. But this other hunter was way too tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and the way it moved wasn't right. More like it was gliding than walking, its arms swinging slowly at its sides. It had long arms covered in dark, shaggy fur. I remember thinking at first that maybe it was someone in some kind of costume, but it was too early for jokes, and honestly, no one comes out here to mess around. Plus, there was something about the way the fur matted and shined in the dim light. Too natural, too real. My heart started pounding, and I realized I wasn't breathing. I didn't want to make a noise, didn't want to draw attention to myself. Then it stopped and sniffed the air. I swear to God, it was like watching a dog catch a scent, the way its head tilted up and those long, strange fingers opened and closed, like it was feeling the air. That was when it turned its head, and I could see its eyes. Dark, but somehow aware, like they caught the light just enough for me to see them move, and it looked right at me, not just in my direction, but at me, straight in the eyes. I can't even describe the feeling. It was like being sized up, like it knew I was there, and it was deciding something. We just stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but it must have been only a few seconds. My whole body was frozen. I knew I should raise my rifle, do something, anything, but I couldn't. It's like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, like my hands just forgot how to work. The thing, whatever it was, finally turned and moved back into the shadows, so quietly for something that size. 1 second it was there, the next it just melted into the forest, like it was never there at all. I must have sat there for a while, staring at the spot where it disappeared. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to stand up, my legs shaky like they were about to give out. I knew there was no way I was staying out there, not after that. I've hunted in those woods for years, but something about that moment, that look, told me I wasn't supposed to be there anymore. Not that day, maybe not ever again. I climbed down from the stand, every step feeling too loud, like I was afraid it might come back if it heard me. The forest was still quiet, no birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the ground. It's funny how something you've done a million times, like walking back to your truck, can suddenly feel like the longest, most dangerous journey. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, waiting for another glimpse of that dark shape. But it never came. By the time I got back to my truck, I was drenched in sweat, even though it couldn't have been more than 50 degrees out. I tossed my gear in the back, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I remember just sitting there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, trying to tell myself that maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my eyes playing games with me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I've spent too many hours in those woods, seen too many things, to mistake something like that. I drove out of there as fast as I could, the whole time feeling like I was being watched, like if I looked in the rearview mirror, I'd see it running after me. I didn't look. I didn't want to know. I just kept driving until I hit the main road, and even then, I didn't slow down. It wasn't until I got home that I realized my hands were still shaking. Since then, I haven't been back to that spot. I don't even know if I could find it in me to go hunting again. I've tried to tell a couple of friends about it, but they just laugh it off, say I must have seen a bear or something. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't another hunter. It was something else, something that didn't belong, and it knew I was there. Sometimes late at night I think about those eyes, the way they locked onto me, like it was trying to figure me out. I don't know what it wanted or why it just left, but I'm glad it did. I've read stories about people seeing strange things in the woods, and I always thought it was just that, stories. But now, I'm not so sure. Maybe there's more out there than we'll ever understand, and maybe sometimes we're better off not knowing. I don't have any proof, and I don't expect anyone to believe me. But if you ever find yourself out there, in the early morning light, and the woods go quiet, just leave. Trust me, it's not worth finding out what's watching you. I grew up in the countryside, and I know that the forest can play tricks on you, especially at night. The noises get louder, the shadows get longer, and any little animal looks like a monster lurking in the darkness. But what happened that night a few months ago still sends a chill down my spine. And worst of all, I know it was real. It all started when some neighbors commented on strange invasions on properties in the area, cattle disappearing, fences broken, noises in the middle of the night. I didn't pay much attention until one of my fences was destroyed in such a way that it looked like a truck had driven over it. I got worried, so I decided I would spend a whole night watching the farm. I had done this before, but only to scare away foxes or some little thief trying to steal my chicken coop. This time, something seemed different. It was a moonless night, the kind of dense darkness you can almost touch. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting on the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to keep my eyes open. A cold breeze was blowing through the trees, and the sound of crickets was practically the only thing keeping me company. Then I heard a noise, a dry crack like branches breaking, coming from the side of the barn. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. Probably a deer, I thought. I took the flashlight and walked slowly in the direction of the sound. When I got close to the barn, that's when I saw it. A tall silhouette, much bigger than anyone I'd ever seen. It was slightly bent over, and for a second I thought it was a huge man, perhaps one of those thieves the neighbors had mentioned. I aimed the flashlight, and when the beam of light touched the figure, I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't a man. It was a creature covered in thick, dark hair and its arms were disproportionately long, almost reaching the knee. The thing turned towards me for a second, and I saw the glint of its eyes reflecting the light. It wasn't like the eyes of an ordinary animal, it seemed conscious. Before I could even think about doing anything else, the creature turned and ran towards the forest. And when I say ran, I'm not exaggerating. It moved so quickly and silently that it seemed impossible. All I could do was stand there with the flashlight pointed into the void, my heart beating so hard I thought I was going to faint. I'm not a man who's easy to impress, but at that moment, I felt real fear. Fear like I had never felt before. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to listen for any noise that might indicate that the creature was still around. The silence was absolute, and that only made it all the more terrifying. The forest was completely still, without even the sound of crickets. I went back to the porch and stayed there, unable to sit down or take my eyes off the direction of the forest until the sun began to rise. When the day finally broke, I plucked up the courage to go back to the barn and take a closer look. I wanted to believe that it had just been my imagination, some trick of the dark, but when I got there, I saw the marks on the ground, huge, deep footprints imprinted in the soft soil near the barn. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were wide, and the shape wasn't exactly human. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt wrong, as if something that shouldn't have been there had left those marks. I took pictures of the footprints with my cell phone, but when I showed them to some friends, no one could tell what they were. Some laughed, others said it must be a bear. But I know the area, and I know there are no bears here. Besides, those footprints weren't bear tracks. I spent the whole morning trying to find any other sign, anything that would indicate that it had been a prank or some animal I didn't know. Nothing, just the footprints and the emptiness in the forest. I decided to install security cameras on the farm after that day. I spent a lot of money, and even so, I never saw anything like it again. The cameras picked up nothing, no strange movements, no silhouettes sneaking around the barn. I should be relieved, but the truth is that it makes me even more nervous. Whatever it was, it seemed to know exactly what it was doing. And the fact that it never showed up again makes me wonder if, in fact, it wasn't just watching me, waiting for the right moment. To this day, when night falls, I avoid going outside the barn. It's as if something inside me knows that it's still out there, that at some point it might come back. I've spent many nights alone on the farm, but since that day, I can't relax like I used to. I always feel like I'm being watched, especially when I'm near the forest. And I know it might just be my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling is real enough to keep me awake some nights. I wish I could say that I'd found an answer, that I'd investigated until I discovered what it was. But the truth is that I simply have no explanation. I don't know if it was some kind of unknown animal, or if it was something else, something I'd rather not even think about. All I know is that I saw it, and that no matter how many people think I'm exaggerating or making it up, it happened. And there isn't a single day when I don't think about those eyes shining in the darkness and that shadow fleeing into the forest. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced anything like that, but I sincerely hope not. The kind of fear I felt that night was unlike anything else. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was a deep, almost primal fear, as if I knew, deep down in my soul, that it shouldn't be there, that I was seeing something that no one should see. And that's what scares me to this day. The farm is quiet now, no more broken fences or strange noises at night. But something inside me changed after that night. I look at the forest differently now, as if it holds secrets I'd rather not know. Maybe it's just my mind trying to find an explanation for the inexplicable, but either way, I know what I saw. And honestly, I hope I never see anything like it again. I've never been the kind of person who believes in these things about strange creatures, like Bigfoot or something like that. I always thought they were just stories to scare children or attract tourists to lost places. But what happened to me that afternoon while I was walking my dog in the reserve is something I simply can't explain, and honestly, it still sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon, and I decided to take Max, my 5-year-old Labrador, for a walk in a small reserve near my house. We always liked that place. It was quiet, usually empty, perfect for a relaxing walk after a busy week. I didn't see any problem with letting Max loose there. He always behaved very well, running a little ahead and coming back when I called. But that day, something was different about him. As soon as we entered the trail, Max started acting strange. He didn't want to move away from me. He kept his ears up and looking at the trees as if something was there. At first I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or some squirrel he had smelled, but he didn't bark, which was unusual. He just seemed nervous, as if he was alert, but not angry but afraid. It's hard to describe, but you could feel that he was restless in a way I'd never seen before. We continued walking, but I also began to feel something strange. You know that feeling that someone is watching you? I looked around and saw nothing, but I couldn't get rid of the idea that something was there. Max started giving little yelps and pulling the lead in the opposite direction, as if he wanted to take me back to the entrance to the trail. I ignored it and kept walking, trying to stay calm. That's when I saw it. Between the trees, a little ahead, something was moving. At first I thought it was a man, but it was too big. Very tall, covered in something that looked like dark fur, and it moved in a way that made no sense. It was fast, but at the same time, silent. It passed through the trees without making a sound. My heart raced and I stood still, trying to understand what I was seeing. Max started growling, something he rarely does. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The figure moved between the trees, and for a while it seemed to be watching me. He stayed in the shadows, but I knew he was staring at me. I don't know how, but I could feel the weight of that gaze. I took a step towards him, perhaps out of curiosity or pure impulse. I wanted to understand what was going on, but when I did, the creature simply turned and disappeared into the dense vegetation, as if it were part of the forest. Max freaked out. He started pulling on the lead with all his might, almost knocking me over. He wanted to get out of there anyway, and it was at that moment that something inside me, a very primitive instinct, told me I'd better go. The air around me felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every fiber of my body was screaming at me not to stay there. I turned, and we started walking back. But it was more of an escape than a walk. Max was practically dragging me down the trail. On the way back, I didn't look back. The fear I was feeling was so irrational and yet so real. I could feel that look in my eyes, as if the creature was still watching us, but keeping itself hidden. Every step I took felt heavy, as if something was holding me there, making me question whether I had really seen it. But Max wouldn't stop, and I didn't want to stay and find out what it was either. When we finally left the trail and returned to the open area, I felt relieved, as if a weight had come off my back. Max also seemed to relax a little, but he was still agitated, looking back from time to time, as if to make sure he wasn't being followed. I couldn't understand what had just happened. It was as if all that fear had been planted in my mind overnight. I got home and tried to process everything. The image of the creature wouldn't leave my head. Its size, the way it moved, and above all, the feeling that I was being watched. I'd been to that reserve so many times before and had never felt anything like it. And Max, who had always been such a calm dog, had never reacted like that to anything. I wondered if it could just be my imagination, but his reaction told me that it wasn't just my head. That night, I could hardly sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure among the trees. I couldn't forget it. I tried searching online to see what it could be, if other people had seen something similar in that area, but I couldn't find anything concrete. Some vague stories, people talking about creatures in the forest, but nothing that really helped me understand what I had seen. This made me even more uneasy. I haven't been back to that reserve since. Every time I go near there, I feel a shiver run down my spine. Something tells me that I wasn't the only one who saw it, but it seems that those who did prefer not to talk about it. And I understand. Even now, writing this here, part of me still doubts what happened. It seems so surreal, but at the same time so incredibly real. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that look, that feeling of being watched. I'm not here to convince anyone, and I don't even know if I completely believe what I saw. But one thing is certain. Something was there. Something that shouldn't have been. And as much as I want to forget it, I have the feeling that creature hasn't forgotten me. Every time I'm alone in a more secluded place, I can't help but look over my shoulder, hoping to see those eyes again, among the shadows, watching me. I'm still trying to process everything, and honestly, I don't know if I'll be able to forget it. It happened to me and my wife a few weeks ago. It was on a mountain road, and even now, just remembering it, I feel that chill down my spine that made me freeze that night. We were coming back from a weekend at a friend's cabin. It was the kind of isolated place, with no cell phone signal, surrounded by nature. It was getting late, and the fog started to get thicker as we drove down the mountain road. It was one of those fogs so thick that it seemed as if the world around us had disappeared, and all that remained was the stretch of road illuminated by the headlights. The air had that strange feeling of heavy humidity, and it seemed that the silence of the night only amplified the noise of the car's engine. That's when we saw it. It was a huge figure far ahead, crossing the road slowly, as if looking for something. It was so unexpected that out of reflex I slowed the car down abruptly. I thought it was a large animal, perhaps a moose or a bear, because it was dark, and the fog made it difficult to see details. But as the headlights hit the creature, I realized that it was like nothing I had ever seen before. The figure was tall, very tall, perhaps more than 2 meters. It moved in an almost deliberate way, as if it knew we were harmless, as if we were invading its space. She was covered in fur, but what really made me freeze was when she stopped and turned her head in our direction. The headlights illuminated a face partly covered in fur, but there was something human about it. The eyes reflected the light in a strange way, and for a second, it felt like I was looking into the eyes of someone else, not some animal. That second was eternal. Time seemed to have stopped. My wife, who until then had been distracted, gasped loudly, and I felt her hand squeeze my arm. She saw it too. It wasn't just my head. The creature stared at us for a few more seconds, then simply turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the trees as if it had never been there. It was a quick and almost silent movement, which was strange for something that size. After it disappeared, the silence returned, heavier than before. It was as if the sound itself had been sucked into the fog, and all that remained was the sound of the car's engine and my accelerated breathing. Neither of us said a word. I just let off the brake and kept driving, not looking around, not wanting to understand what we had just seen. The stretch of road seemed to go on forever, as if we were stuck there forever, in that dense fog and suffocating sensation. I couldn't get those eyes out of my head. There was something intelligent there, something that recognized our presence, something that shouldn't be there, or maybe something that didn't want us to be there. When we finally descended a little further and the mist began to dissipate, I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My wife let out a sigh that sounded like she'd been holding it in since we saw the creature. I looked at her quickly and realized that her eyes were wide, almost as if she wanted to ask if I had seen what she had, but neither of us wanted to break the silence. I think we were afraid of what we might say. When we finally reached the city, we stopped at a gas station to fill up and have a coffee, more to try and calm down than anything else. That's when we looked at each other again, and I realized that we were both pale. My wife finally broke the silence, saying quietly, "What was that?" I just shook my head with no answer. There was no explanation that made sense. Since then, I've been going back to that night over and over in my head, trying to find some logic, some explanation that makes it fit into reality. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe the fog and tiredness made it seem scarier than it really was. But deep down, I know it wasn't that. I know we saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. I've heard of people claiming to have seen Bigfoot, and I always thought it was bullshit, stories to scare tourists or sell TV shows. But after that night, I'm not so sure. The feeling of being watched, the intelligence in the creature's eyes, all of this made me think that perhaps there is more to the world than we can understand. To this day, I haven't talked about it with anyone other than my wife. I know that if I tell other people, they'll laugh or think I'm making it up, and I understand. Before I went through this, I wouldn't have believed it either. But something about that road, that night, changed my perception of what is possible. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to drive through that region again, and honestly, I don't know if I want to. All I know is that, during those few seconds, I felt a fear so deep that it seemed to come from some primal place, as if my body knew that this was not something I should mess with. And that feeling still haunts me. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know I'll never forget it. I've been a park ranger for 7 years, and I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would be afraid to do my job. But after what happened that day in the Watchtower, I'm not the same anymore. It was an ordinary day, nothing extraordinary. The sun had just hidden behind the mountains, and I was up there at my post, monitoring the forest. My routine is to keep an eye out for any sign of smoke or trouble in the area, which means many hours of staring at the same landscape without much news. But that afternoon, something in the clearing below the tower caught my eye. Something was moving down there, something that didn't seem normal. At first I thought it was a moose or maybe a bear, but as my eyes focused, I realized that the thing was different. It was tall, much taller than any bear I'd ever seen around here. The creature had an almost human posture, but was covered in a thick, dark fur. It moved slowly through the clearing, looking around as if it were exploring, as if it knew it was being watched. I stood there, frozen for a few seconds, unable to believe my eyes. My first reaction was to grab my camera. I always have a camera to document anything out of the ordinary, especially in the case of fires or sightings of dangerous animals. But when I finally focused the lens on the clearing, the place was empty, as if the thing had simply disappeared, evaporated between the trees. I had barely taken my eyes off it for a few seconds, and the creature was no longer there. At that moment, I felt a chill run up my spine. Something about the way it moved didn't seem right. It was as if it was aware that I was up there, watching. I'm not the type to panic easily, but this time, something was telling me that this was no ordinary animal. I decided to climb down from the tower to investigate more closely. Maybe it was a stupid decision, but I needed to see what it was up close. As soon as I reached the clearing, the atmosphere seemed different. The place was unusually quiet, as if the whole forest had stopped to watch too. I could see the broken branches on the ground, marks of something big that had passed through. The space was full of signs that proved I hadn't imagined it. There was a trail of footprints leading towards the nearby river. Big, wide footprints, definitely not bear tracks. I didn't know what to do, so I just followed the tracks. I walked for a few minutes, always with that uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched. The trail led straight down to the river. When I reached the bank, the footprint simply disappeared into the water. It was as if it had crossed the river and disappeared on the other side, but I couldn't see any sign of it on the other side of the bank, just the running water and the silent forest. I stood there trying to understand what was happening. That's when I smelled something strange, something like a mixture of wet hair and a strong smell, almost like rotting meat. I had never smelled anything like it, and it came out of nowhere, as if the thing was much closer than I had imagined. My instinct at that moment was to go back to the tower, and I started to back away, feeling my heart speed up more and more. As I walked back, the sound of my own footsteps seemed exaggeratedly loud. Every branch I stepped on, every dry leaf, everything echoed in a way that didn't seem normal. It was as if the forest was amplifying my movements, making it clear that I was there, vulnerable. I swear that for a moment I had the impression of hearing heavy footsteps accompanying me, hidden among the trees, as if something was watching me closely, almost hunting me. When I finally made it back to the tower and climbed the steps, I looked around trying to find any sign of the creature. But I saw nothing. Just the silence of the forest and the uncomfortable feeling that something had just happened, something that shouldn't be there. I locked the door and stayed up there, my eyes scanning every corner of the clearing, trying to find any movement. But no matter how hard I looked, the forest seemed normal again, quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I could never forget that feeling, that something was there, something that was no ordinary animal. I could never look at that clearing in the same way again. I continued working at the station, but always with the feeling that I was being watched. I never saw the creature again, But every time I went down to the clearing, I had that same feeling that something was out of place, as if it could come back at any moment. Today, when I think about it, I feel a mixture of curiosity and fear. I wanted to know what it was. I wanted to understand what I saw, but at the same time I can't forget the feeling of sheer terror that seized me at that moment. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure it wasn't a bear or a moose, and it definitely wasn't something I should have seen. Since then, I've always worked with the camera by my side, but part of me hopes I'll never need to use it again. I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes I think the thing knew I was watching, as if it had come there on purpose, like a warning. And since then, I've never worked in that tower with the same peace of mind. Whether it was real or not, I don't know. But I do know that I saw something that I can't explain, and that's enough to keep me on my toes, even now after so many months. Maybe someone here understands what I've been through. Maybe I'm not the only one. I've never been one to believe in things like Bigfoot, honestly. I always thought these reports were exaggerations or simply scare stories for those who live in the city. But what happened that day from the panoramic viewpoint still gives me the creeps, and I can't find a rational explanation. I'll tell you what happened, and honestly, I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think of it. Some friends and I decided to do a hike and finish it at a well-known viewpoint in the region to watch the sunset. It was one of those perfect summer days when the heat of the day is gone and the air is cooler and calmer. We arrived at the viewpoint, parked the car, and walked up a small hill to where we could get a perfect view of the whole valley. The sun was setting and the sky was filled with shades of orange and pink, and we stood there all together, admiring the landscape. It was Pedro who noticed something strange first. He always carries a pair of binoculars on these trips. He has this kind of exploratory spirit. Out of nowhere, he stopped talking and just stood there, staring at a distant point at the bottom of the valley. I realized that he had become very quiet and asked him what he was seeing, but he didn't answer right away. He just gestured for us to come closer, and when I looked at his face, he seemed to be in some kind of trance. When he finally spoke, he said that he had seen something moving down there, something big. Of course, everyone thought it was a bear or some such animal. We had heard that there were bears in the area, but no one had seen one yet. I took out the binoculars and looked in the direction he was pointing. At first I thought it was just a shadow among the trees, but then I saw it. It was a tall, erect figure covered in dark hair. It was walking down the slope in an almost calm. It had none of the ungainly gait of a bear. It was something that moved like a human, but it was much bigger and clearly not a person. I remember the shiver that went down my spine at that moment. I stood still, almost breathless, as I watched the figure continue to move, as if it were in no hurry at all. When the creature stopped and looked straight up at us, my heart almost stopped. It was as if, for a second, it knew exactly where we were, as if it sensed that it was being watched. Then, without warning, she turned and disappeared into the trees, as if she had never been there. I stood there, binoculars still in my eyes, trying to find any sign of movement, but I couldn't see anything else. I passed the binoculars to the others, but when they tried to look, there was nothing left. Everyone kept trying to find something, any sign that I wasn't going mad, but the figure had completely disappeared, as if it had blended into the forest. We all stood there, exchanging glances, not knowing what to say. Pedro swore he wasn't seeing things, and I knew he wasn't either. There was something there, and the way it moved was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I know it sounds cliché, but the atmosphere changed after that. That viewpoint that had seemed so beautiful and peaceful now seemed like a threatening place. The wind seemed colder, and the sound of the leaves rustling in the trees gave me the feeling that something or someone was still watching us. No one wanted to talk much about what they had seen, but you could see on everyone's face that it wasn't just a story to laugh about later. We walked back to the car in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but one filled with tension that no one knew how to relieve. I think we were all trying to process what we had seen, trying to find an explanation that didn't sound absurd. I wanted to believe it was a bear, but my mind kept bringing back the image of those long legs, of that gait that seemed almost human. On the way back, Pedro finally broke the silence, saying he wouldn't tell anyone else. He was clearly uncomfortable and didn't want to be the laughing stock of his friends. We all agreed, a little relieved not to have to explain it to anyone else. It was as if admitting it out loud made it all the more real, and we didn't want to deal with that. But even after we decided that we would forget about it, I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that moment when the creature looked straight up, as if it knew exactly where I was. I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an animal, that there was something more to it. It was as if, for a moment, I was just another part of the environment, something insignificant being watched by something much bigger and older. Today, I don't have a conclusion for you. I don't know what we saw, and I'm not going to say that it was definitely a Bigfoot or anything like that. But I do know what I felt. It was a primitive fear, something that made me feel completely vulnerable, as if it was on a different level to me. Since that day, I can no longer look at forests in the same way. I always expect to see something moving among the trees, something that shouldn't be there. That's it. Maybe I'm getting paranoid. Maybe it was just a big, unusual animal. But I know that the feeling I had wasn't normal. That thing, whatever it was, knew we were there, and that look was no accident. I still think about it a lot, and, honestly, I'd rather not have seen anything. Some things perhaps are better left at the bottom of the valley, away from our prying eyes. I grew up in the countryside, always surrounded by nature and the sounds of the forest. I was used to hearing owls, coyotes, and even raccoons rustling among the branches. But what happened a few weeks ago was different. It's been difficult to even put it into words, but I decided to share it to see if anyone else has experienced something similar. It all started with a strange noise, a sound that didn't belong to anything I'd ever heard before. It was like the sound of branches breaking, but not randomly. It sounded heavy, deliberate. I used to hear these sounds in the middle of the night, always at the same time, around 2 a.m. At first I thought it was some big deer or maybe a bear, something that had strayed near the farm. But there was something about that sound that made me uneasy, a rhythm that seemed intelligent, almost as if it was moving with purpose. One night, the noise was louder than ever. I was in the kitchen, having a cup of tea before going to bed, and I heard the branches breaking as if something huge was moving along the edge of the forest, right behind the barn. The sound echoed. It seemed that each step made the ground shake a little. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to listen better. I'd already let it go on for several nights, but something inside me said that tonight I needed to see what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and heavy coat and went out the back door. Walking around the farm at night had never scared me before. The countryside is my home. I know every corner of it like the back of my hand. But as I made my way towards the sound, something felt wrong. There was a strange feeling of being watched, and the air seemed heavy, dense in a way that's hard to describe. When I got close to the clearing next to the forest, the sounds stopped. Everything became incredibly quiet. No crickets, no wind, just absolute silence. I pointed the flashlight ahead, and that's when I saw it. A tall figure crouched down, fiddling with something on the floor. I could only make out its silhouette at first, but even then my heart froze. The thing was huge, much bigger than any person. Its fur looked dark and thick, and it was so focused on whatever it was doing that it didn't even notice the torchlight straight away. My whole body went into alert mode. I wanted to run, but my feet were nailed to the ground. When the creature finally stood up, I felt a lump in my throat. It turned towards me, slowly, and then its eyes met mine. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, they were conscious, in a way that terrified me. The face looked like a bizarre mixture of human and animal, as if it was something that shouldn't exist. The features were almost familiar, but at the same time completely wrong, distorted. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it. Maybe it was seconds, maybe minutes. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears. The creature didn't move, it just stood there looking at me. That's when I realized that I needed to get out of there, and I started to back away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. With every step I took backwards, I was sure that the thing was going to jump on me, but it just stood there, unmoving. When I finally managed to get far enough away, I turned and ran. I ran like I'd never run before in my life, the cold of the night cutting into my face, but I couldn't think of anything else but getting to the safety of my house. When I slammed the door behind me, I threw myself on the kitchen floor, trying to catch my breath. I stood there for a while, staring at the door, hoping to hear any sound that might indicate that it had followed me. But I heard nothing, just the heavy silence of the night. The next morning, even though I was still scared, I decided to go back to the clearing. Part of me wanted to believe that it had all been some kind of hallucination, perhaps caused by tiredness or the darkness of the night. But when I got there, I found the footprints. They were huge, much bigger than a human foot, and deeply marked in the soft soil. I followed the footprints for a few meters, but they disappeared into the densest part of the forest, where the ground was harder. Since that day, I've never been able to leave the house at night. I was always the kind of person who liked the quiet of the night, walking around the farm, checking out the animals. But now, just the thought of going out after dark sends a shiver up my spine. The farm lights are on all the time, as if that could drive away whatever it was I saw that night. I still hear the sounds from time to time, although they've never been as close as on that particular night. I know it may sound like an exaggeration, but something inside me has changed since that encounter. It's not just the fear of meeting that creature again, it's as if my perception of what is real has been shattered. I always thought I knew the forest, that I knew exactly what could and couldn't be there. But now, I'm not so sure anymore. Whatever it was, it shouldn't be there, it shouldn't exist. And yet I saw it with my own eyes. To this day, I try to understand what happened. I've thought of all the rational possibilities, a bear, someone playing a trick, maybe even a hallucination, but none of these explanations seem to fit with what I saw and felt that night. It's as if, somehow, I had seen something that wasn't meant to be seen, something that belonged to a world other than our own. Since then, I've avoided talking about it. I think part of me is afraid that talking about it will make it more real, but at the same time, I need other people to know, maybe even to tell me that I'm not crazy. I don't know if anyone here has been through something similar, but if you have, please share. I just want to try to understand what it was that I saw, and whether I'll ever be able to feel safe again on my own farm. I know that, in the end, I may never have an answer to what happened. Maybe it's just one of those things that happen and go unexplained, a memory that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But the only thing I know for sure is that I never want to meet that thing again. Since that night, the forest behind my house has never been the same for me. It is now a place of mystery and, above all, fear. I've always been a fan of solitary walks, especially in more secluded places where you can just listen to the sound of nature and feel that peace that seems so hard to find these days. Last weekend, I decided to follow a trail beside a stream in a less frequented area of the forest, a place I've only visited a few times, but which I've always found beautiful. It was a calm morning, the air was fresh and there was a light mist over the stream. So far, everything was exactly as I expected. I'd been walking for about an hour and a half when I started to hear a strange noise, something like a hollow, distant sound, but which stood out among the noise of the running water. I thought it was an old tree falling, a normal occurrence in more isolated areas. I ignored it and moved on, but the sound was repeated, and it seemed a little closer. That's when I realized it wasn't just the sound of wood, it was more like something heavy hitting the water. I decided to stop and try to understand what was going on. I looked across the stream and noticed a series of large stones falling into the water, one after the other. They were coming from the opposite bank. At first I thought it might just be a landslide, but the stones were falling in a strange way, as if they were thrown on purpose, one by one. That's when I started to feel that something was wrong. My instinct told me that I wasn't alone there, and that chill that comes out of nowhere. That's exactly what I felt at that moment. After a few more stones were thrown, I finally saw it. Between the trees, something moved, and I could make out an immense figure, something I couldn't immediately describe. It was huge, covered in dark fur, and seemed to be watching my reaction. My heart leapt immediately, because it wasn't just any animal. It had an almost human posture, but it was much bigger than any man I'd ever seen. The creature seemed conscious, as if it was trying to push me away, and honestly, I didn't want to find out why. I stood there, perhaps for too long. You know when fear holds you in place? That was it. I could only stare at that figure, trying to convince myself that it was just an illusion, perhaps a strange shadow from the trees. But then the thing moved again, and for a second I saw its eyes. It was as if time had stopped. They were big, dark eyes, and the way they stared at me was not one of curiosity, but of warning. A silent warning that said, "Get out of here." As soon as I felt that look, something inside me finally snapped. My body went into survival mode. I turned around and started walking quickly back the way I came, trying not to run, because I had the feeling that running could trigger some worse reaction. My mind was racing, and every sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves seemed to be amplified. I was sure that this thing was following me, even if I couldn't see it. It was a palpable sensation, as if I could feel its eyes on my back. With every step I took, the feeling of being watched only increased. It seemed that no matter how far away I got, I was still being watched. My heart was beating so fast that I could hear it in my ears. The trail that had once seemed peaceful now seemed endless, and all I wanted to do was get out of there as quickly as possible. At one point, I heard another stone being thrown, this time with enough force to make a loud crash in the water. I didn't look back. I just couldn't. After some time, I finally reached a point on the trail where the stream turned away and began to disappear into the forest. That's when the sensation began to subside, very slowly, as if the thing had decided I'd gone far enough. Still, I kept walking, almost on autopilot, just wanting to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever it was. I've never felt so relieved to see my car parked at the entrance to the trail. When I got home, I was exhausted, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I tried to rationalize it in various ways. Maybe it was just someone trying to scare me, or some animal I'd never seen before, but none of it made sense. I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear or an ordinary person. It was something different, something that seemed to have enough intelligence to want me out of there. And whatever it was, it got what it wanted. Even now I can't stop thinking about that thing's eyes. The way they looked at me, as if I were a threat, or even worse, as if I were trespassing in a place I shouldn't have been. I always thought that stories about Bigfoot or things like that were just legends, inventions of people wanting attention. But after this, I really don't know anymore. I'm not saying it was a Bigfoot, but it was definitely something I can't explain. Since then, I haven't been back to that trail, and frankly, I don't think I will be anytime soon. Something about that place has changed for me. That feeling of peace and isolation has now been replaced by an irrational fear, as if I'm constantly being watched, even indoors. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that figure among the trees, watching me, and I wonder if it's still there, throwing stones into the stream, hoping that no one else will show up. I don't know if anyone has ever had a similar experience, but I needed to get it off my chest. Part of me still tries to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks, perhaps a combination of shadows, sounds, and tiredness. But honestly, the fear I felt at that moment was too real to be just imagination. Whatever it was, I hope it stays far away from me. And if anyone out there likes secluded trails as much as I do, just be careful. Sometimes nature holds things that you're not really prepared for. So, I don't usually share stuff like this, but what happened to me last summer still messes with my head. I work for the Forestry service, and a big part of my job is checking those remote service roads. You know the type, narrow, bumpy as hell, barely any maintenance. They wind deep into the forest, places most people never go. Honestly, I like it that way. It's peaceful, no tourists messing up the scenery, just nature and me. But one particular day, nature didn't feel so peaceful. I was driving down this old rutted service road, way out where cell service doesn't even pretend to exist. I had a gate up ahead that I needed to open, one of those old metal contraptions that keeps unauthorized vehicles from wandering where they shouldn't. I parked, got out of the truck, and started walking towards the gate. It was one of those rare days when everything felt almost too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on gravel. I remember thinking it was odd, but I brushed it off, until I saw it. Standing maybe 30 or 40 feet up the embankment, just inside the tree line, was this figure. Tall, really tall. At first I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but something about it was wrong for a bear. It was covered in this dark, almost black hair, but the shape was different. It was upright, more like a person, but way bulkier. My brain kind of froze for a second, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing was just standing there, staring at me. My heart started pounding, like that sudden realization when you know you're not alone. I've seen bears before. Hell, I've chased bears off. But this wasn't a bear. It had these broad shoulders, long arms that hung down almost to its knees. The head wasn't quite right either. It was more rounded, with no real neck, just sort of blending into the shoulders. And the eyes. I swear they looked curious. Not aggressive, but like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was doing there. I remember every second feeling like an eternity. I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I slowly shifted my weight, stepping backwards towards my truck, keeping my eyes on it the whole time. My gut told me not to turn around, not to look away. I don't know if it was fear or instinct, but something in me was screaming to stay calm, stay slow. The creature just watched. I could see its chest rising and falling, and I swear I could almost hear it breathing in the quiet. I finally made it back to the truck door, my hand fumbling for the handle without looking away. I was terrified that the noise might set it off, that it might charge or, I don't know, do something. But it didn't move. It just stood there watching. I slid into the truck, shut the door as quietly as I could and locked it, as if that lock would have done anything if it decided to come closer. My fingers were trembling so bad that I almost dropped the keys trying to start the engine. When the truck finally roared to life, I expected it to scare the thing away, but it didn't flinch. It just turned its head slightly, almost like it was more curious about the noise than scared of it. I put the truck in reverse, slowly backing away, keeping my eyes on that shape between the trees. And then, just like that, it turned. It moved so smoothly, slipping between the trees and disappearing into the forest like it had never been there at all. 1 second it was watching me, the next it was gone. I sat there for a minute, engine running, just staring at the spot where it had been. My brain was doing that thing where it tries to convince you that you didn't really see what you saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe just shadows. But I knew better. There was no mistaking it. The size, the way it moved, the way it watched me. That wasn't my imagination. Eventually I got out, opened the gate, hands still shaking, and drove through. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me on edge. I've never felt that kind of tension out in the woods before. Usually the forest is like a second home to me, but that day, it felt different. Like I was an intruder, and something out there was letting me know it. I've told a couple of my co-workers about it, and they either laugh it off or just nod, like they've heard this kind of thing before but don't want to talk about it. One guy, older than me, just said, "Yeah, there's things out there," and left it at that. I've gone back to that area a few times since, but I haven't seen anything like it again. Still, I can't shake the feeling whenever I drive that road, that something's there, just beyond the trees, watching. I don't know what I saw that day. I've heard all the stories, Bigfoot and all that, but I never put much stock in them. Now, I'm not so sure. I just know that it was real. It was there, and it was watching me, and whatever it wasn't scared of me. If anything, it felt like I was the one who wasn't supposed to be there, like I was in its territory. I've spent my life in the woods, but that was the first time I ever truly felt out of place. Sometimes, late at night, I replay it in my head. I think about those eyes, the way they seemed almost intelligent, curious. I don't think it wanted to hurt me. If it did, it easily could have. But there's something unsettling about knowing that it's out there, that it saw me, and I have no idea what it was thinking. All I know is that I'll never forget that feeling, the raw, primal sense that I had crossed a line and something was watching from the shadows, deciding what to do about it. I never thought I'd be one of those people who write on a forum to tell of a strange experience. I've always been a bit skeptical, you know? Stories of creatures in the woods, mysterious things happening in isolated places. I thought it was all a bit far-fetched. But after what happened in my garage that cold winter's night, my perspective changed completely. I needed to share it with someone, and I thought this might be the right place to do it. It was one of those nights when the cold seemed to creep in through any crack in the house, sharp and insistent. My garage is a good 30 meters from the house, kind of isolated, and I basically use it to store junk that doesn't fit inside. Old tools, some wooden boxes and equipment I no longer use. It was late. I had just settled down on the sofa with a blanket, ready to watch some crap on TV before going to sleep, when I heard the noise. A dry thud, followed by other smaller noises, as if something had fallen and was rolling across the floor. At first I thought it might be a raccoon, or perhaps a cat that had come in looking for shelter from the cold. It wouldn't be the first time an animal had wandered in where it didn't belong. But the sound was different, too heavy for a small animal. I grabbed a flashlight from the sideboard by the door and reluctantly put on a coat. Something inside me told me to let it go, that I could see it in the morning, but curiosity was stronger. The walk to the garage seemed longer than usual. The snow made a crunching noise under my boots, and the light from the flashlight could barely penetrate the darkness of the night. The closer I got, the more I had the feeling that this was not a good idea. When I reached the door, I found the padlock unlocked, hanging from the chain. I was sure I had locked it, but I didn't think much about it at the time. My mind was trying to come up with quick explanations, as usual. I opened the door slowly and smelled the harsh scent of dust and grease. The flashlight illuminated a pile of boxes lying on the floor, things strewn about as if someone had rummaged through them looking for something. My heart was racing, more out of nervousness than fear, until that moment. It's when you think you're dealing with something you can control, like a dog or a rat, that reality catches you off guard. I pointed the flashlight towards the back of the garage, where there are some old shelves that I hardly ever touch. And that's where I saw it. A huge, upright figure covered in dark fur. It took my mind a few seconds to process what my eyes were seeing. It was too big to be a person. And the way it was half-curved, with broad shoulders and a small head in proportion to its body, made me realize that it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I don't know if it was the sound of my breathing, or if the light from the flashlight flickering in my hand bothered it, but the creature turned its head towards me. Its eyes reflected the light, not like an animal's eyes, which usually glow green or yellow. These were different, a faint, almost opaque glow, as if it didn't really see me, but knew I was there. My body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. All I wanted to do was get out of there, but my feet seemed stuck to the ground. Then, in a quick and unexpected move, the creature turned around and ran to the back of the garage, disappearing into the darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing inside was the most real and frightening thing I've ever heard. I didn't think twice. I slammed the door as hard as I could and locked the padlock as fast as I could. I ran back to the house, hardly feeling the cold or the biting wind. When I finally closed the door behind me, my hands were shaking so much that it took me a while to pick the lock. I stood there, trying to hear anything coming from the garage, but all I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears and my panting. I spent the rest of the night in a state of alert. I tried to look out of the window a few times, but I couldn't see much beyond the darkness and the falling snow. Every little noise, every crack of the house made me jump. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, so I sat in the kitchen with the flashlight by my side and a knife in my other hand. I felt ridiculous, but at the same time I couldn't just ignore what had just happened. What scares me most, thinking back now, is that I don't know what it was or where it came from. I never saw any footprints in the snow the next day, nor any sign that anything had passed that way. The garage door was intact, and the neighbors, few that I have, didn't hear anything different that night. It was as if it had all been a very vivid nightmare, but I know I was awake. I know what I saw. Since then, I haven't been to the garage at night. I don't even feel comfortable in there during the day. There's something about knowing that, whatever it is, it could come back at any moment that always sends a chill down my spine. I may never find out what really happened that night, but one thing is certain. I haven't been the same since, and frankly, I hope I never have to see anything like it again. So, this happened about a year ago, and I haven't really talked about it much until now. I guess I just needed some distance before I could even try to make sense of it. It's still kind of a mess in my head, but here it goes. Maybe some of you can help me figure out what the hell really happened. I was in Texas, out in one of those really remote areas where the roads just kind of stop being paved and turn into endless stretches of dirt and scrub. I was following up on some reports I'd gotten from locals. You know, the usual kind of sightings, strange noises at night, large figures moving through the woods, that sort of thing. Yeah, I know, it's all very Bigfoot hunter cliché, but this time it felt different. The reports were more specific, more consistent, and honestly, I was desperate for a lead that wasn't a total dead end. Anyway, I was driving along, trying to follow the coordinates on my GPS, when I realized I had crossed onto someone's land. No fences or signs, just a feeling that the trees seemed a little too orderly, almost like they were planted that way on purpose. The road turned from dirt to this weird gravel that crunched differently under the tires, and that's when I saw him, a tall, gaunt figure standing in the middle of the path holding a rifle. I stopped the truck, rolled down my window and gave a little wave, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. The guy, he looked like he hadn't had a proper meal in months, long and wiry, wearing a faded military jacket. He just stared at me for a moment, and then, without a word, he motioned for me to get out of the truck. I'm not an idiot. I know a dangerous situation when I see one, but something about the way he looked at me made me comply. It wasn't just the rifle. It was like he knew exactly what I was doing there, like he'd been expecting me. When I got out, he finally spoke. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice raspy, almost like he hadn't used it in a long time. I tried to explain that I was just looking for something, a creature people had seen around these parts. He cracked a smile, not a friendly one, and said, "Bigfoot, right? You're one of those guys." The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he knew something I didn't. He told me his name was Skinny. Yeah, Skinny. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the way he pointed that rifle right at my chest while he said it. He said he owned the land and that people like me weren't welcome. I apologized, figuring this was the end of it and I'd be on my way. But then he did something weird. He lowered the gun and told me I could stay, for a price. He said he'd let me look for whatever I wanted, but I'd need to sign a contract. No questions, no liability. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of his jacket and handed it to me. It was just a handwritten note, basically saying he wasn't responsible if anything happened to me out there. The whole thing felt off, like it was some kind of setup, but at the same time, I was curious. I've heard stories about people disappearing while looking for Bigfoot, and maybe part of me thought this was my chance to get closer to the truth. I signed it. I know, stupid, but I signed it. He smiled that same unsettling smile and told me to follow him. We walked for what felt like hours deeper into the woods. There was no trail, just Skinny moving through the trees like he'd done it 1,000 times. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustle of branches. That's when I started to notice the cameras, tiny, almost invisible, mounted high up in the trees. I pointed one out and Skinny just shrugged. "Security," he said, but he wouldn't say more. Eventually we reached a clearing. In the middle of it, there was this structure. It looked like an old bunker, half buried in the ground, with a metal door that had no handle. Skinny stopped, turned to me and said, "This is as far as you go." He wouldn't explain what the bunker was for, wouldn't even look at it. He just stood there, staring at me, waiting for me to do something. I felt this pressure in the air, like we were being watched, not just by the cameras, but by something else, something I couldn't see. I decided right then that I was done. I didn't care about Bigfoot anymore, didn't care about the reports or the footage I was hoping to get. There was something wrong with that place, with Skinny, with the whole situation. I told him I was leaving, and he just nodded, like he knew I'd chicken out eventually. The walk back felt even longer, and I swear I could hear things moving in the woods around us just out of sight. Skinny didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. When we got back to my truck, he didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked back into the woods, disappearing between the trees like he was never even there. I got in my truck and drove, not even bothering to check the GPS. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. It wasn't until I was back on a paved road that I realized my hands were shaking. Later, I tried to look up the area on a map, tried to figure out who Skinny was or what that bunker might have been. That's when things got even weirder. The land wasn't registered to anyone named Skinny. In fact, it wasn't registered to anyone at all, just marked as government property, some kind of black site, no details, no records, nothing that made any sense. I even asked around a bit, but the locals wouldn't talk about it. They just told me to stay away, that Skinny wasn't someone I wanted to mess with. I haven't been back since, and honestly, I don't plan to. Whatever's out there, it's not just Bigfoot. I don't know if Skinny was protecting something or if he was part of it. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in those woods that doesn't want to be found. And after that day, I'm more than happy to leave it alone. I never thought I'd be one of those guys who ends up writing a story like this. I'm a hunter, born and raised in Louisiana, and I've spent more time in the woods than I care to count. The swamp, the sounds of crickets, the thick humidity, it's like home to me. I'm used to the rustling of leaves, the distant howls, and the eerie quiet that sometimes takes over. But nothing, I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was late October, and I was out for a night hunt, scouting for some wild hogs. I found a good spot near the swamp and settled in. After a couple of hours, I finally saw 2 hogs just barely visible under the moonlight. They were close enough, so I took my shots. Both went down, just like I expected. But as soon as the echoes of the shots faded away, there was this strange quiet. Normally, you'd hear the scurrying of critters or birds taking off. This time it felt like the whole swamp had sucked in its breath. I started feeling that prickling sensation. You know, like someone's eyes are on you. I thought it was just nerves, maybe adrenaline from the kill, but it just wouldn't go away. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, heading back to my truck. As I walked, I could swear I heard something following me, the sound of heavy, deliberate steps staying just out of sight. Every time I stopped, it stopped too. I'd turn around, squinting into the dark, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but there was nothing there. By the time I reached my truck, I was already on edge. I've heard stories, of course. Who hasn't around here? People talk about things out in the woods, things that don't quite fit any animal we know. I've always brushed it off as nonsense. Hunters getting spooked by shadows, the usual. But that night, as I tried to get my truck out of the mud, I started to believe some of those old tales. The truck's tires were spinning uselessly, throwing muck everywhere. I was cursing under my breath, trying to figure out how I'd get myself unstuck, when I noticed it. Total silence. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, not even the rustle of leaves. It was unnatural. You hear hunters say, when the forest goes quiet, you're not alone. Well, that's exactly what happened. My gut sank like a stone. Then came the sound, a sharp crack of a branch breaking, loud enough that it had to be something heavy. I froze, rifle in hand, and strained my ears. It was close, too close for comfort. I flicked on my night vision scope, peering into the dark, green-tinted shapes coming into focus. That's when I saw it. Something moving between the trees, something tall. It was huge. I'm not exaggerating here. I'm talking at least 9 feet tall. My heart just about leapt out of my chest. It wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a man. The way it moved, almost gliding between the trees, was something I'd never seen before. The figure turned, just for a moment, and I could see 2 faint glowing eyes reflecting back. My hands were shaking as I aimed the rifle, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. What if I missed? What if I just pissed it off? In a panic, I fired 3 shots into the air, a desperate attempt to scare it off. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the thing turned and moved deeper into the forest, disappearing into the dark. I could still hear it for a few moments, those heavy footsteps fading away until everything went silent again. I've faced a lot in the woods, snakes, gators, even a pissed-off black bear once. But nothing, and I mean nothing, scared me like that did. I finally got my truck out of the mud, but every second felt like an eternity. I kept expecting to see that thing reappear, to feel those eyes on me again. When I finally got back on the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. But even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me. I got home and tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I was tired, maybe it was just some trick of the light. But deep down, I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't my imagination. Whatever it was watching me, following me, and it knew exactly what it was doing. The weirdest part? After that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Even now, sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I get that same prickling feeling, like there's something just beyond the trees, staying out of sight, but keeping its eyes on me. It's enough to make me question whether I want to keep going out there alone. I've talked to a few other hunters since then, trying to gauge if anyone else has seen anything similar. Most just laugh it off, but a couple of them got real quiet when I mentioned the details. One old-timer just nodded and said, "You're lucky it let you be." That stuck with me. Lucky? I don't feel lucky. I feel like I walked away from something I wasn't supposed to see. I know how this sounds. If someone else told me this story, I'd probably roll my eyes and call them crazy. But I was there, and I'll never forget what I saw that night. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or some other creature that hasn't got a name yet, but I do know one thing. There's something out in those woods, and it's not afraid of us. Since then, I've stuck to hunting during the day. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's survival instinct, but I don't plan on finding myself out there after dark again. Whatever that thing was, it let me go once, and I'm not about to push my luck a second time. To this day, I still hear those heavy footsteps in my dreams, and every time I wake up drenched in sweat, grateful to be in my own bed and not out there, alone in the dark. I still can't believe I'm actually writing about this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. This happened during the Mississippi floods a few years back, and it was the kind of day you don't easily forget. I was part of a helicopter rescue crew, helping to evacuate families from rooftops. The water was relentless, covering everything, turning neighborhoods into unrecognizable murky lakes. I thought I'd seen it all. But then this happened, and it changed everything I thought I knew. We got the call about a family stranded on the roof of their house. A father, a mother, and 2 kids. When we arrived, it was chaos below us. The river had swallowed everything. Trees, cars, pieces of people's lives just drifting aimlessly. We lowered the winch, and the father was the first to come up. I was watching the water, just scanning like I always did. You have to be aware of what's around, especially in situations like that. That's when I saw it. Something big, moving with purpose. At first I thought it was just debris, maybe a log, a piece of a tree, something like that, but it wasn't. It was black, bulky, and it moved against the current, not with it. I remember my stomach dropping. There was this weird, primal feeling that made me grip the side of the helicopter a little tighter. The thing was heading straight towards the house where the rest of the family was still waiting to be lifted. I yelled at my buddy to hurry it up. But honestly, I don't think he needed me to say anything. He'd seen it too. The mother was next on the winch, and she hadn't noticed it yet, thank God. But the father, who was now in the helicopter with us, was staring down with wide eyes. He was shaking, and I could hear him mumbling something like, "It's back, it's coming." I asked him what he meant, and he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Bigfoot." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in his voice, just raw fear. I glanced back down, and whatever that thing was, it was getting closer, moving like it had a destination, like it knew exactly where it was headed. The mother was barely in when we decided to break protocol. We usually take it slow, keep everyone calm, but there was nothing calm about this situation. We pulled the kids up together, one under each arm, and I'll be honest, I was scared. Not scared of getting in trouble for breaking procedure, but scared of whatever the hell was swimming towards that house. The thing was huge, and the way it cut through the water was unnatural, like it belonged there, like it was more at home in the flood than anything else. When we got everyone on board, I looked back one last time, and I swear I saw it. A dark, massive shape, almost at the roof now, just where the family had been moments earlier. I didn't get a good look at its face or any distinct features, but I saw the movement. Arms, legs, something swimming with intention, not thrashing like a person would. It was graceful, almost eerie in how fluidly it moved. And then, just as quickly as we'd seen it, we were out of there, the house and that thing shrinking away beneath us. Back on the ground, I tried to wrap my head around what just happened. The father kept talking about it. He said he'd seen it before, lurking near the woods by their property, but he never thought it would come this close. He called it a protector once, but there was nothing protective about the way it moved towards them in the water. He seemed more terrified than anything, like it had been waiting for this moment, like the flood had given it the perfect opportunity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the dark shape cutting through the water like it was on a mission. I'd heard of Bigfoot before, of course. Who hasn't? But I'd always dismissed it as myth, something people made up to scare each other around campfires. But seeing something so big, so real, moving with that kind of speed and determination, it's hard to keep dismissing it after that. I started looking into other stories, other encounters, and I was shocked at how many people had reported seeing similar things during natural disasters. It was almost like these creatures were drawn to the chaos, to the places where people were most vulnerable. I found stories from flood victims, from people who'd been caught in wildfires, even some from hurricane survivors. They all described the same thing, a large, dark figure, watching, moving, sometimes even seeming to help, but always just out of reach, just beyond what felt normal. I don't know if what I saw was really Bigfoot. I mean, how do you even begin to process something like that? But I know it wasn't just a log or a shadow. It was something alive, something that shouldn't have been there, and it scared the hell out of me. Even now, every time I see footage of floods or natural disasters, I find myself scanning the background, looking for that same shape, that same movement. Part of me wants to forget it ever happened, to chalk it up to stress, exhaustion, the chaos of the day. But the other part of me knows better. I wasn't the only one who saw it. The whole crew did, and that father, he knew exactly what it was. There was a kind of recognition in his eyes, like he'd been waiting for it to show up. And that's what scares me the most. The idea that maybe, just maybe, these things are always out there, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I've talked to a few people about it since then, but most just laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy. I get it. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd probably react the same way. But it's real. Whatever it was, it's out there. And it's not just some harmless creature hiding in the woods. It's something else, something that knows when we're at our weakest. And that's when it comes. I don't have any answers. I don't know if I ever will, but I needed to share this, to put it out there in case someone else has seen the same thing, in case I'm not alone in this. Maybe there's more to these stories than we're willing to admit. Maybe these creatures aren't just myths. Maybe they're a part of our world, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the floodwaters to rise again. I swear this was supposed to be just a normal vacation. Nothing special, just a break from my regular life. I was in Nicaragua, staying at this cozy little resort by the edge of the jungle. It was beautiful, serene, everything you'd expect. One morning, I decided to go for a run to shake off all those cocktails and lazy afternoons by the pool. The resort manager had mentioned a trail nearby, and I figured, why not? Just me, the birds, and the cool morning air. The run started out great. The air was fresh, and the forest was alive with all those tropical sounds, insects buzzing, birds calling, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It felt like one of those moments you see in a travel ad, like I was finally disconnecting from everything. After a while, the trail got a bit narrower, and the undergrowth was getting thicker. I slowed down a bit, more to avoid tripping on roots than anything else. That's when I first noticed something odd. At first I thought it was just my imagination, like the way your eyes can play tricks on you when you're alone in the forest. I saw something, just barely, moving in the corner of my eye, something dark, blending in with the shadows. I turned my head, but whatever it was disappeared behind the trees. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a monkey or some kind of big bird. But then, as I kept running, it happened again. And again. I wasn't scared at first, more curious than anything. It's like, You know when you feel like you're being watched? I started to get that feeling. I kept running, but my focus shifted from my own feet hitting the dirt to trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. That's when I finally saw it. Clearly this time. There was something running parallel to me, just inside the tree line. It was tall, covered in dark hair, and it moved both on two legs and sometimes on all fours. It was fast, really fast, but it didn't feel like it was chasing me. It felt more like it was playing with me. I know it sounds weird, but it didn't seem aggressive. It was keeping pace, sometimes even pulling ahead, and then pausing as if to let me catch up. I think I even laughed once, out of pure disbelief. I mean, who does that? Who gets played with by some hairy creature in the jungle? But that's exactly what it felt like it was just messing around. I'd slow down, and it would slow down. I'd speed up, and it would do the same. It was like we were locked into this strange little game. I could see it better now. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. Its body was bulky but not lumbering, and its eyes, I could swear I saw a glint of something curious there, something almost friendly. Maybe that's just me trying to rationalize it, but I didn't feel any real danger from it. Not yet, anyway. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Out of nowhere, the entire vibe of the forest shifted. It was like every bird, every insect just stopped. The silence was deafening. And then I heard it. A deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from somewhere further into the jungle. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard before. It was so low that I could almost feel it reverberate in my chest. The playful creature, Luke, as I later found out, immediately froze. It looked back into the depths of the jungle where the sound had come from, and in that instant it went from playful to terrified. Without even looking back at me, it took off, moving so fast that it was almost a blur. It wasn't playing anymore, and that's when I realized whatever made that sound, it was bigger, and it was dangerous. I've never felt such a pure shot of adrenaline. My body seemed to take over, and I turned and started running harder than I ever had before. The path seemed longer on the way back, every rustle and crack making my heart pound harder. I kept expecting something to burst out of the trees behind me, but nothing did. When I finally made it back to the resort, I was drenched in sweat and probably looked like I had seen a ghost. One of the staff, an older guy, was sitting outside and saw me coming. He must have noticed how freaked out I was because he came right over, asking if I was okay. I tried to explain what I'd seen, this creature running beside me, the roar, everything. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was imagining things, but he didn't. He just nodded, like he knew exactly what I was talking about. He told me the creature's name was Luke. Apparently some of the locals knew about him. They said he was harmless, just curious, and maybe a little lonely. He wasn't the one to be scared of. No, the real danger was his father, the roar I'd heard. That was his father, a much bigger, much more dangerous creature. The man told me that they'd seen him before too, but unlike Luke, the father didn't play games. He didn't come to the edge of the jungle to have fun. Hearing that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just that I'd seen something unexplainable. It was the fact that this man was telling me that whatever I'd seen was real, and that there was something worse out there. I asked him if Luke ever hurt anyone, and he shook his head. But then he looked toward the jungle, his face growing serious, and said, "His father's different. You're lucky he called Luke back." I spent the rest of that day feeling like I was in some kind of daze. Part of me wanted to go back out there, to see if I could find Luke again, maybe understand more. But a bigger part of me knew that I'd be an idiot to try. I couldn't shake that feeling of dread, that whatever made that roar was still out there, somewhere deep in the jungle, and that it had noticed me. The staff were kind. They tried to reassure me, but I could tell they were relieved I made it back. I stayed at the resort for a few more days, but I couldn't bring myself to go near that trail again. I kept thinking I'd see something from the edge of the property, a flash of movement, a shadow darting between the trees, but there was nothing. It was like the jungle had swallowed everything back up, and whatever had happened was just some bizarre fever dream. But I know it wasn't. I know what I saw. Even now, back home, I still think about Luke, about how in those first few moments it felt like he was just curious, like a kid who wanted to play. And then about how quickly everything turned. I wonder if he's still out there, if he remembers me at all. And I wonder about his father. If he's still watching the edge of the jungle, waiting for something or someone to make the wrong move. I guess what sticks with me the most is how quickly it all shifted. From something almost magical to something that made my blood run cold. It's like the jungle has its own rules, its own way of deciding what's safe and what's not. And for a while, I was part of that game. I don't think I'll ever go back there, but if I did, I'd stay far away from that trail. Because whatever's out there, Luke, his father, they're real, and they're watching.